Margaret Ellis pressed both hands flat against the cracked earth and felt it dry, hollow, dead 3 feet down. Behind her, the ranch foreman was already laughing. "You gonna talk to the dirt now, woman?" She didn't answer him. She pressed harder, closed her eyes, and listened the way her father had taught her when she was 8 years old and the world still believed women were worth listening to. The ground had a pulse. Faint. But there. She stood up, slowly, brushed the dust from her palms, and said the words that would change everything. "There's water under here, 40 feet, maybe less. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell and follow along until the very end, because this one is going to go somewhere you don't expect. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled." Now let's begin. The morning Caleb Whitaker turned away his last hired hand. He didn't say much. He walked to the fence line at the eastern edge of his property, put one boot up on the lowest rail, and stared out at what used to be the finest grazing land in Cutter County. The grass was gone. The creek that ran through the middle of his father's land had pulled back to a thin brown thread. The cattle that remained were ribby and slow-moving, their heads hanging low, the way animals' heads hang when they've given up expecting anything good. He pulled the letter from his shirt pocket and read it again, though he already knew every word. The Merchants' Bank of Helena had given him 60 days. 60 days to show the land was productive. 60 days to demonstrate that the ranch could generate enough income to service the debt his father had carried, and that Caleb had inherited, along with everything else: the house, the equipment, the cattle brand, and the stubborn belief that Whitaker men did not quit. He folded the letter back up and pressed it flat against his chest. He was 38 years old, and he felt like 70. Caleb. His ranch hand. Tom Briggs came up behind him, hat in hand. Tom was a good man, honest and hard-working, the kind of man who'd been with the Whitaker family since Caleb was a boy. "I'm real sorry about this. You know I don't want to go." "I know it," Caleb said. He didn't turn around. "It's just that Martha's expecting again and I can't." "Tom." Caleb's voice was quiet but final. "You don't owe me an explanation. You've got a family to think about. Go home to them." There was a long pause, then the sound of boots on dry ground moving away. Caleb stood there alone and breathed in the smell of dust and dead grass, and the particular silence that settles over a place when everything living has decided to give up and go somewhere else. He thought about his father. Daniel Whitaker had built Willow Creek Ranch with his own hands on land that most men said couldn't be worked. He'd been told it was too dry, too rocky, too far from the rail lines. He'd built it anyway. Ran 300 head of cattle at peak. Employed 12 men. Sent Caleb east for 2 years of schooling at a proper agricultural college so that the next generation would know not just hard work, but the science behind it. And then the drought came. Slow and merciless, the way real disasters always are. Not a sudden catastrophe, but a long, grinding erosion. One dry season turning into 2. The creek pulling back. The grass thinning. The cattle count dropping. His father had spent the last 3 years of his life fighting it, borrowing against the land to buy feed, trying every technique he knew. He died in the spring of 1879, with the debt unpaid and the land still dying around him. Caleb had come back from the east to bury him. He never left. That had been 2 years ago. 2 years of fighting a battle his father had already been losing. 2 years of waking up before dawn and working until he couldn't see straight, and falling into bed knowing that tomorrow would be the same as today, only worse. I knew what people in town were saying. He'd heard it at the feed store. He'd heard it at the post office. He'd heard it at the saloon on the one occasion a month when he allowed himself a single drink and some human company. Whitaker Ranch is done. Boy just won't admit it. Shame, really. His father worked that land for 30 years. The bank'll have it by Christmas. He heard them say it, and he made himself stand straight and look them in the eye and not flinch, because the one thing his father had also given him was the refusal to let other people's certainty become his own. But standing at that fence line in the morning heat, with the letter folded against his chest, Caleb Whitaker let himself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. The despair. The exhaustion. The particular weight of knowing you've done everything right and none of it has been enough. 30 seconds. Then he pushed himself off the fence, squared his shoulders, and walked back toward the barn to figure out what in God's name he was going to try next. He was in the middle of the yard when he heard the creak and rattle of wagon wheels coming down the access road. He turned and shaded his eyes. A covered wagon, dust-coated and road-worn, moving at the slow, patient pace of something that had traveled a long way and was not in a hurry about the last 100 yards. As it came close enough for him to see the driver, he realized it wasn't a man holding the reins. It was a woman. She pulled the wagon to a stop about 20 feet from where he stood. She was large and heavy-set, with a round face and dark eyes that were taking in the ranch with an expression he couldn't quite read. She wore a faded blue prairie dress that had seen better days and an old beige apron over it. Her dark hair was pinned up neatly. She had the kind of stillness about her that made you notice it, not the stillness of someone nervous or uncertain, but the stillness of someone who had learned long ago not to waste motion. She set the brake on the wagon, climbed down without asking for help, and walked toward him with a steady, measured stride. "You Caleb Whitaker?" she asked. Her voice was even and unhurried. "That's right," he said. "And you are?" "Margaret Ellis. I heard in Harlow Creek you might be looking for help around the place. Cooking, household management, whatever you need." She held his gaze without looking away. "I'm a hard worker. I don't complain, I don't cause trouble, and I won't ask you for anything you can't give." Caleb looked at her for a moment. She looked right back. He thought about sending her away. He had barely enough money to feed himself, let alone take on another person. And he didn't need a cook. What he needed was rain and a miracle, and $30,000, none of which this woman was likely to be carrying in that battered wagon. But there was something about the directness of her eyes that made him pause. Most people who came to him now had pity in their faces, or skepticism, or that particular expression that meant they were already calculating what they might get out of the ruins when the ranch finally went under. This woman had none of that. She just looked at him straight and waited. "I can't pay much," he said. "Truth is, I can barely pay anything right now." "I don't need much," Margaret said. "Room and board and a fair wage when you're able. That'll do for now." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he stuck out his hand. "All right, Miss Ellis. Welcome to Willow Creek." She shook it once firm and businesslike and went back to unhitch her horse. The two hands still working at the ranch, 17-year-old Pete Dawes and the older cowhand named Horace Greer, who'd been too loyal to the Whitaker name to go anywhere, watched. Margaret arrived with expressions that Caleb recognized immediately. He'd seen that look in town, the quick assessment, the casual dismissal. "That who he hired?" He heard Pete mutter to Horace low, but not low enough. Horace said nothing, but the look on his face said plenty. Margaret didn't acknowledge either of them. She led her horse to the corral, unloaded her wagon with practiced efficiency, and got to work without being told where anything was, figuring it out herself by walking through the house and barn with those calm dark eyes taking everything in. By evening, there was a proper meal on the table for the first time in weeks. Nothing fancy, beans and salt pork and cornbread, but hot and solid, and made with the particular competence of someone who knew how to feed working people. Caleb sat down across from her at the kitchen table and noticed she'd already organized the shelves and the pantry without anyone asking her to. "You've run a household before," he said. "Many times," she said. "You eat Mr. Whitaker. You look like you haven't been taking proper care of yourself." He almost said something sharp about that. Then he realized she was right and ate instead. For the first 3 days, Margaret did exactly what she'd been hired to do. She cooked and cleaned and kept to herself. She was quiet and efficient and largely invisible, which was clearly what she intended. But Caleb started noticing things. He noticed that she was up before he was every morning, which meant she was up before dawn. He noticed that she took longer routes than necessary between the house and the barn and the water pump. He noticed the way her eyes moved across the land when she thought nobody was watching. Slowly, methodically, the way a person moves their eyes when they're reading something written in a language other people can't see. On the 4th morning, he found her crouching at the edge of the south field, her fingers pressing into the earth, the way he'd seen geologists do, studying the composition of the soil. She had her apron hitched up to keep it from the dirt, and she was entirely focused, turning the earth over in her palm and examining it with an expression of intense concentration. He stopped a few yards away. "Miss Ellis." She looked up. For just a fraction of a second, so quick, he almost missed it. Something flickered in her face, not guilt exactly, but the particular expression of someone who's been caught at something they weren't sure they had the right to do. "Mr. Whitaker." She stood up smoothly and brushed the dirt from her hands. "Breakfast is on the stove. I was getting some air." "You were studying my soil," he said. A pause. "The cooking fire needed more wood. I came to check the Miss Ellis." He said it gently, but it stopped her. "I saw what you were doing, and I've been watching you for 4 days. Do things that have nothing to do with cooking and housekeeping. So why don't you tell me what's actually going on?" She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in those dark eyes, a decision being made. "Your soil's being misread," she said. "That's the simplest way I know to put it." "What do you mean, misread?" "I mean that everyone who's looked at this land has made the same mistake. They've looked at the surface and drawn conclusions about what's underneath." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The surface is bad. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But the surface isn't the whole story." Caleb studied her face. "Go on." "There's an old creek bed," she said. "Dry now, been dry a while by the looks of it, but the mineral patterns in the soil along the southern edge." She stopped, looked at him with those frank dark eyes. "How much do you know about soil composition, Mr. Whitaker?" "Enough," he said. "I had 2 years at the Agricultural College in Massachusetts." Something happened in her expression, then a slight surprise quickly controlled. "Then you know what iron deposits in dry soil can indicate." "Subsurface moisture," he said slowly. "Capillary movement from a water table. Or from an underground source," she said. "Something deeper. A channel or a reservoir. Something that hasn't been tapped." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dry, cracked ground of the south field. Then he looked back at her. "Where did you learn to read soil like that?" She met his eyes steadily. "My father," she said. "He was an agricultural researcher. We traveled a great deal when I was young. He taught me to see things." "Your father," Caleb said. "What was his name?" "Robert Ellis," she said. "He worked out of the university in Philadelphia for a time. Before—" She stopped. "Before things changed." Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, "What do you need to be sure?" That surprised her. He could see it in the small shift of her posture. She had been braced for skepticism, for dismissal, for the kind of polite patience that really means, "Go back to your kitchen, woman, and let the men think about the real problems." She hadn't been expecting a straight, practical question. "Maps," she said, recovering. "Old survey maps if you have them. And time to walk the perimeter of the south and west fields. And someone willing to dig a few test holes. When do you want to start?" She blinked once. "You're going to take my word for it." I'm going to give you the chance to prove it," he said. "Those aren't the same thing. I've been fighting this land for 2 years, Miss Ellis, and I've run out of other ideas. If you've got one, I'm listening." She nodded once, precise and businesslike. "After breakfast," she said. She turned back toward the house. He watched her go and tried to figure out what exactly had just happened. He'd intended to come out here and tell her to stick to what she'd been hired for. He wasn't sure how he'd ended up agreeing to let her walk his property lines instead. There was something about her that he couldn't quite locate in any category he had for people. She wasn't what she looked like. He was becoming increasingly certain of that. The question was what she actually was underneath the quiet competence and the faded dress, and the careful way she measured out her words, like someone who'd learned the hard way that too many of them got used against you. He went into breakfast and tried to think about water tables instead. The maps were in his father's office, rolled and dusty in a corner cabinet, survey maps from the original land grant updated twice since then, as the county expanded and the creek shifted. Margaret spread them on the kitchen table after the dishes were cleared and stood over them with an expression of focused attention that he'd never seen on anyone's face that wasn't a professor's or an engineer's. Here, she said, pointing to a line on the oldest map, the one dated 1849. This is the original creek route. You see how it bends. That creek's been dry since, he thought. Since before my father bought the land. He said so. Said it dried up in the 1860s. Yes, Margaret said. But creeks don't disappear. They change course. They go underground. Her finger traced a path on the map. If this original channel went underground here, and the watershed is what I think it is, based on the mineral deposits I've been seeing. She looked up. Mr. Whitaker, what's under the land on the western edge? The rocky section past the hill. We never used it, he said. Too rocky to graze on, not enough topsoil to farm. My father wrote it off years ago. Has anyone ever surveyed it properly? He thought about it. Not that I know of. She nodded, like that confirmed something she'd already suspected. That's where I'd want to start. Pete and Horace were not enthusiastic about the expedition. Caleb told them to bring shovels and follow along, and they did, but the expressions on their faces made their feelings about it plain. She thinks there's water out in the rocks, Pete muttered to Horace as they walked the western trail. The cook thinks there's water out in the rocks. I can hear you, Margaret said without turning around. Pete shut up. She led them along the rocky ridge with the same methodical attention she'd given the soil samples, pausing every so often to crouch and look at something, a plant growing from a crack in the stone, a particular stain of color on the rock face, an arrangement of gravel that meant something Caleb couldn't read. She made occasional marks on a piece of paper she'd folded into her apron pocket. Right here, she said, finally stopping at a spot that looked to Caleb like every other spot on that ridge. I want to see what's at 3 feet. Then 6. You want us to dig in solid rock, Horace said. The surface is rocky, she said, still patient, still unhurried. 18 inches down the composition changes. You'll hit softer ground. Start there. Horace looked at Caleb with an expression that said quite plainly, he thought this was a waste of effort. They didn't have to spare. Caleb looked back at him with an expression that said dig anyway. They dug. It was hard going, and Pete complained under his breath the entire time, and nothing happened for the first hour and a half. Then Caleb's shovel hit something wet. Not the muddy wet of recent rain. Something deeper. Something that hadn't been dry for a very long time. He stopped and looked at Margaret. She was already looking at him. Keep going, she said quietly, but slowly. They kept going slowly, and 20 minutes later, the water came up. Not a flood, not at first. A seep. A slow push of dark, wet earth that smelled of minerals and depth and old stone. Pete made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a curse. Horace took his hat off and held it in front of his chest. Caleb looked at Margaret and could not immediately find words. It'll need proper excavation, she said, and her voice was calm, but her eyes were bright. And a pump or a gravity-fed channel if the grade allows it. But it's there. It's been there all along. She paused. This is what I was trying to tell you. How did you know? Caleb asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Because I listened, she said simply. To the land. Most people stopped listening to this land a long time ago and just started waiting for it to die. Pete stood up out of the half-dug hole with water at his boots and looked at Margaret with an expression that wasn't quite the same as the one he'd had 3 hours ago. She was right, he said, as if he was telling Caleb something. Caleb wasn't already standing there watching with his own eyes. Margaret didn't respond to that. She was already crouching again, marking angles in her notebook, working out the grade lines in her head. The problem was the timeline. Even with the underground source confirmed, digging proper channels and getting water moving to the south fields would take weeks. The bank inspector was coming in less than 3. Caleb drove into Harlow Creek that afternoon and stood in front of the assayer's office and did the math in his head, and the math did not come out in his favor. He was walking back to his wagon when he heard the voice. Whitaker. He turned. Franklin Dunmore, town councilman, owner of the largest parcel of dry goods in the county, and the man who'd been quietly circling Willow Creek Ranch like a vulture for the last 8 months, was standing on the boardwalk in front of the mercantile with 2 other men whose names Caleb knew, but whose company he'd always avoided. Heard you had some activity out at the ranch, Dunmore said. His voice was friendly in the way that meant it wasn't. Some kind of digging operation. Just property maintenance, Caleb said. That right? Dunmore smiled. It was the smile of a man who knows the ending of a story. Word around town is you've got a woman out there telling you where to put your shovels. The cook. He let that sit a moment. A woman of her particular proportions, telling a rancher how to manage his land. The two men with him made sounds that weren't quite laughs. Caleb said nothing. Caleb, Dunmore said, and now his voice dropped to something that was almost kind, which made it more offensive. I've put a fair offer on the table. It stands for 30 more days. After that, he shrugged. Well, banks don't negotiate once they start proceedings. I appreciate your concern, Caleb said. He held the man's gaze long enough to make the length of it felt. Then he got on his wagon and drove back to the ranch. He rode most of the way back without thinking about Dunmore. He was thinking about something else. He was thinking about the moment on the rocky ridge when Margaret's face had been lit with that particular brightness. Not triumph exactly, but the deeper and quieter satisfaction of being proven right about something you've known all along, but been unable to make anyone else see. He'd seen that look before. On his father's face, on the faces of men he'd respected. He'd never particularly thought about whether a woman could carry that look until the moment he'd seen it on hers. He pushed the horses a little faster. Margaret was in the yard when he got back, deep in conversation with Pete. A conversation Pete was apparently taking seriously, nodding and asking questions with his hat respectfully in his hands. Horace was nearby, close enough to hear doing work he didn't need to do in that particular location. Caleb recognized the behavior. It was what men did when they wanted to overhear something and didn't want to look like they wanted to overhear something. He climbed down from the wagon and walked over. What kind of channel grade? Pete was asking. 2 to 3% is ideal, Margaret was saying. Steep enough to move water, shallow enough to control it. Any steeper and you're dealing with erosion on the channel walls, which undermines the whole structure. She looked up and saw Caleb. How was town? Informative, he said. Dunmore knows about the digging. Something shifted in her expression. How much does he know? He knows enough to be making noise about it. Caleb paused. He's also clearly decided it's funny. The idea of a... He stopped himself, but not before she heard the hesitation. The idea of a woman like me finding what his surveyors missed, she finished for him evenly. That's what he implied, yes. Margaret nodded once. There was something in her face that Caleb couldn't entirely read. Not hurt exactly, and not anger either, though both were somewhere behind what he was seeing. It was the expression of someone who has been told the same unkind thing so many times that the sharp edge of it has worn to something dull, something they carry without thinking about it, because there's nothing else to do with it. Let him laugh, she said. It won't change the grade of the water table. No, Caleb agreed. It won't. There was a beat of silence between them. Then she said, I've been thinking about the timeline. The inspector is in 3 weeks. I know. We can't get water to the South Fields in 3 weeks through conventional excavation. Not with 2 men and the equipment you have. She paused. But we might be able to demonstrate productivity in a different way. What way? The section closest to the ridge, the edge fields. If we can route water there first, it's a much shorter run, and the ground there is better, more receptive. We could have grass showing in 2 weeks if the water moves. That's a small section to show a bank inspector. It's enough to demonstrate the concept, she said. Enough to show that the land is capable, that the problem was water access, not the quality of the land itself. She met his eyes. Banks lend against potential, Mr. Whitaker, not just against current condition. If we can show them the land has potential, real demonstrable potential, that changes the conversation. He looked at her for a moment. Did your father teach you about bank negotiations too? Something almost like a smile crossed her face, the first real one he'd seen. No, she said. That I learned on my own. Pete. Caleb turned to his hand without looking away from her. You hear all of that? Yes, sir, Pete said. Get Horace. We start digging the edge channel first thing tomorrow. Yes, sir. Pete moved off with what Caleb would have described as enthusiasm if he hadn't seen the boy's face 3 hours ago when he'd been calling her the cook. Caleb looked back at Margaret. "You'll need to show us exactly where." "I'll have the grade lines marked by dark," she said. He nodded and started toward the barn, then stopped, turned back. "Miss Ellis." She looked at him. What they said in town, what Pete said this morning, what Dunmore. He stopped, finding himself unusually not quite sure what he was trying to say. "It isn't right," he said finally. "The way people have been talking about you." She was quiet for a moment. "I've heard worse," she said. "That doesn't make it right." She looked at him with those dark, straight eyes for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "No, it doesn't." He went to the barn, and she went to mark her grade lines, and neither of them said anything else about it. But something had shifted between them in those 30 seconds that neither of them was quite ready to name yet, and both of them felt it, and neither of them forgot it by morning. The days that followed were some of the hardest working days Caleb had experienced in a life built on hard working days. He was up before dawn and in the channels until his arms gave out, and then he rested an hour and went back. Pete worked beside him without complaining anymore, with the particular converted energy of a young man who has seen something with his own eyes that has rearranged his understanding of how things work. Horace worked steadily and asked no unnecessary questions, which was his way of showing respect. Margaret was everywhere. She worked alongside them in the channels for half the day, which no one had expected. Sleeves rolled up and hands in the dirt, as capable with a shovel as any of them, and stronger than she looked. The other half of the day she spent on the edge fields, studying the grade, adjusting the channel angles by increments that seemed tiny, but that she said would matter when the water finally moved. She ate standing up, or didn't eat at all, and she slept fewer hours than any of them, and she never made a single sound of complaint about any of it. She talked to Caleb constantly about the work. She talked to him about soil composition and water movement, and what the edge grass would need in its first week of water access, and how long before they'd see visible growth. She talked about his father's original pasture rotation plan, and why it hadn't worked, and what she'd do differently, and how the herd numbers would need to adjust to the recovered acreage. She was precise and practical and completely serious about every word she said. But occasionally in the evenings when the work slowed, and they sat on the porch with coffee and the last of the day's light, she'd say something different. Something personal, almost despite herself. Something that arrived sideways when her guard was a little lower than usual. "My father used to say that land doesn't lie," she said one evening. "People lie about land. People assign value based on what's easy to see. But the land itself, it just is what it is. It doesn't care what you think of it." "He sounds like he was a remarkable man," Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment. "He was the only person who ever took me seriously," she said. "Whoever looked at me and saw what I was actually capable of. Instead of—" She stopped. He waited. She shook her head slightly. "It doesn't matter." "It does actually," Caleb said. "Matter." She looked at him sideways, with an expression he was starting to recognize the look she got when he said something she hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. "He died 4 years ago," she said. "And after he was gone, people decided his work was valuable after all. They just didn't think it belonged to me." "What happened?" She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "There were men. Business partners of his, or they said they were. They came with documents and lawyers, and the argument that a woman couldn't possibly have been the primary researcher on his later work, that she must have merely been the secretary, the domestic help." She said the last 2 words with a precision that made them very slightly sharp. "They took his journals, his published papers, the patents that were filed in his name, but built on work we did together." She paused. "I had no recourse. I was a woman, and I was alone, and they were wealthy men with attorneys, and the law in those instances is very clear about whose word carries weight." Caleb said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the edge of the property where the new channels were barely visible in the fading light. "So you left," he said. "I left," she said. "What else do you do?" "You keep moving. You find work where you can. You keep your head down, and you don't tell people what you know because it's safer not to." She paused. "Until it isn't anymore." He looked at her then in the evening light with her sleeves still rolled and her hair escaping its pins from a full day of physical work, and felt something so clear and so simple that he was almost startled by it. It was recognition. The precise sensation of recognizing something you've been looking at without seeing clearly. "They were wrong," he said. "The men who took your father's work. They were wrong, and what they did was theft. What they took from you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said quietly. "It was. And I'm sorry that happened to you, Miss Ellis." Something moved through her face. Something complicated and old, and not entirely resolved. The way grief moves through people when they've been carrying it so long, they've gotten used to the weight, and then something unexpectedly shifts it and reminds them it's there. "Margaret," she said. He looked at her. "You can call me Margaret," she said. "If you'd like." He nodded. "Caleb," he said. And they sat for another hour in the evening quiet and watched the last of the light leave the sky over the dry hills that had begun in the smallest and earliest way to have hope in them again. On the 12th day, the water reached the edge fields. It came slowly at first, the way it always does, when something has been waiting a very long time, feeling its way along the new channels, spreading into the cracked ground in dark widening stains, soaking downward and sideways both at once. By the end of the afternoon, the edge section had gone from the dull pale beige of dry, exhausted earth to something darker and richer and alive-looking. And by the next morning, the first thin green threads of grass were visible to anyone looking closely enough. Caleb stood in that field in the early morning and put his hand on the damp ground and felt something break open in his chest that he hadn't let break for 2 years. "It's going to work," he said. His voice came out unsteady. Yes, Margaret said beside him. "It is." He didn't look at her right away. He needed a moment. He needed a moment to put back the thing that had broken open, because there was still work to do, and a bank inspector coming, and Dunmore waiting for his carcass, and he couldn't afford to come undone over a patch of green grass no wider than his kitchen table. Then he looked at her, and she was watching him with those dark eyes that saw things people didn't expect them to. And something passed between them in that look that had no name yet, but that both of them understood without needing one. "We've got 9 days, he said. "I know," she said. "Then let's get back to work." And they did. 9 days. That was all they had, and every single one of them counted. Caleb started driving himself harder than he'd driven himself in 2 years, which was saying something because the last 2 years had nearly broken him. He was up before the sky turned gray, and in the channels before the first bird made a sound. He worked until his hands blistered, and then worked through the blisters. He stopped eating full meals and started eating whatever Margaret put in his hand while he was walking between one problem and the next, because sitting down to a proper meal felt like time he couldn't afford. Margaret matched him hour for hour and then some. She didn't ask him to slow down. She didn't suggest he pace himself. She simply moved alongside him with that same focused, relentless energy. And when he made a mistake, when he cut a channel grade too steep and the water moved too fast and started eating the edges, she corrected it without making him feel like a fool, just came over with her level and her marks and said, "Here, try it at this angle." And he did, and it worked. Pete had stopped muttering under his breath sometime around day 2 of the digging. By the middle of the first week, he was asking Margaret questions before he asked Caleb, which Caleb noticed and said nothing about, because the boy was learning things in a week that most men didn't figure out in a season, and there was no sense interrupting a good education on account of pride. Horace said very little, as was his way, but Caleb caught him one afternoon standing at the edge of the new channels with his hat off, looking at the water moving through the stone and dark soil, and the old man's expression was one of pure, uncomplicated wonder. The expression of someone who expected one thing from the world and got something entirely different. 40 years working land. Horace said not to anyone in particular. "Never saw that before." "Saw what?" Pete said. "Water coming back," Horace said. "Seen plenty of it going." That was the most words Horace had strung together in one sentence since Caleb had known him. On the sixth day, the first serious problem arrived. It wasn't the bank. It wasn't Dunmore. It was the channel wall on the northern run that gave way at 3 in the afternoon, a section of the bed they'd cut through clay-heavy soil that hadn't held under the water pressure the way Margaret had calculated it would. The water spread sideways instead of forward, soaking into ground that had no drainage pooling instead of moving. Margaret heard Pete shout from halfway across the property and was running before Caleb was. She stood at the edge of the broken section and looked at it for about 10 seconds, and then said, "Get the boards from the east side of the barn, the wide ones, and the rope." "What are you going to do?" Caleb asked. "Redirect it," she said. "We can't fix the wall today, so we work around it. There's a secondary grade." She was already walking the line, eyes down, measuring angles in her head. "Here. If we reinforce this edge and angle the flow left, we add about 4 feet to the channel run, but we don't lose the water." "That'll take most of the night," Caleb said. "Then we work most of the night," she said without looking up. He looked at her back for a moment. Then he went to get the boards. It took until 2 in the morning. Caleb lost track of time somewhere around midnight, operating on muscle memory, and the particular narrowed focus that comes when the body is too tired to do anything except the one thing directly in front of it. At one point, he looked up and realized he couldn't remember the last 20 minutes, only that his arms had kept moving and the channel was further along than it had been. Margaret worked the entire time without stopping, except once when she sat down hard on a rock and put her head down for a moment. Just a moment. Then she was back up. "You can rest," Caleb said. "I can finish this section." "So can I," she said and picked up the rope again. By the time they got the redirect working and the water moving in the right direction again, it was past 2, and the sky had gone very dark and very quiet. They sat side by side on the ground at the edge of the channel and listened to the sound of the water moving, which was small and constant, and in that moment, the most beautiful sound Caleb could remember hearing. "You need to sleep," he said. "So do you," she said. "Ladies first." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. The first real one he'd heard from her, and it was brief and surprised and a little rough, like a sound that hadn't been used in a while and wasn't sure of its footing. "Don't start being chivalrous at 2 in the morning, Caleb. It's too late in the day for it." He looked at her sideways. Her hair had come entirely free of its pins, and her dress had mud to the elbow, and she was too tired to be performing any version of herself, just sitting there exactly as she was, worn out and competent and completely present. "I'm not being chivalrous," he said. "I'm being practical. I need you functional tomorrow." "I'll be functional," she said. "You were limping on the left side around 10 o'clock. She looked at him sharply. "You were watching me." "I was watching the channel work," he said. "You happened to be part of the channel work." She held his gaze for a second. Then she looked back at the water. "Old boot," she said. "The seam's been wrong for months. It rubs. We'll get you new boots." "You can't afford new boots right now." "When this is done then." She didn't answer that, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a person shifts when they hear something they don't entirely believe but want to. They sat for a few more minutes in the dark and the quiet. Then she said without looking at him, "Caleb. What happens if the inspector decides it isn't enough? The edge fields the new channels. What if he looks at it and says it's not sufficient to hold off the bank?" He thought about the honest answer, and then gave it to her because she'd never given him anything but honesty, and he figured she was owed the same. "Then I lose the ranch," he said. A pause. "And then what?" "And then I figure out what's next," he said. "Same as you did when they took your father's work." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a brave way to think about it." "No, it isn't," he said. "It's just the only way that doesn't make me crazy." She made that almost laugh sound again, quieter this time. Then she got to her feet, brushed the dirt from her skirt, and held out her hand to him. He looked at it for a half second. The gesture surprised him, simple and unself-conscious as it was, and then he took it, and she pulled, and he got to his feet. She let go immediately, and they walked back to the house without speaking, and he fell into his bed with his boots still on, and was asleep before he had the thought to take them off. The next morning the telegram came. Pete brought it in from town, looking like he wasn't sure whether to apologize. Caleb read it once, set it down on the kitchen table, and read it again to make sure he'd understood it correctly. Then he looked up. Margaret was watching him from across the table. "What is it?" "Banks moved up the inspector visit," he said. "He's coming in 4 days, not 9. The silence in the kitchen went very flat. "4 days," Margaret said. "Done more," Caleb said. The word came out short and controlled and very tight. "He's on the bank's county advisory board. I should have remembered that. I should have—" He stopped, pressed his hands flat on the table. He pushed the timeline up. He's been waiting for an excuse and the digging gave him one. If the inspection fails now, he gets first right of purchase before anyone else can make an offer. "He told the bank you were making unauthorized excavations," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "That'd be my guess." Caleb's voice was level. The leveling of it was taking significant effort. "Cast it as a sign of desperation, or instability. Something that makes the bank nervous enough to move early. Can you contest it? On what grounds? He hasn't broken any rules. He's just—" He stopped again. Let out a slow breath. "He's smart. I'll give him that. He's been patient, and he's been smart, and I walked right into it." Pete was standing in the doorway, looking miserable. "I'm real sorry, Mr. Whitaker." "Not your fault, Pete." Caleb looked at Margaret. 4 days. You tell me honestly, is it enough?" She thought about it. He watched her think about it, the way her eyes went distant and focused at the same time, working the problem, calculating what he couldn't. "The edge fields will show growth," she said carefully. "Real growth. Not spectacular, but real. The channels are, if we work today and tomorrow without stopping, the main channel run will be functional. The question is whether we can get enough grass visible on enough acreage to make the case. And what's your honest assessment of that?" She held his eyes. "It'll be close," she said. "It'll be very close." "But possible." "Yes," she said. "Possible." He stood up from the table. "Then let's not waste another minute." What followed were 2 days that Caleb Whitaker would describe for the rest of his life as the hardest 48 hours he ever lived through, including the years of drought and the morning he buried his father. They worked in a sustained, driven silence, broken only by necessary communication. Margaret's instructions, his responses, Pete's questions, Horace's occasional terse observations about grade or flow. They ate standing up. They slept in fragments. The water moved through the main channel by the afternoon of the second day, slower than Margaret had wanted, faster than Caleb had feared. The grass on the edge fields grew thin and green and new and absolutely real. On the evening before the inspector was due, Caleb stood at the edge of the recovered section and made himself see it honestly, the way an inspector would. It was small. He couldn't pretend it wasn't small. In the context of the whole ranch, it was a modest patch of returned land, visible proof of a concept, but not yet proof of a transformation. Whether it would be enough depended on who was looking and what they were willing to see. "Tell me it's enough," he said. "I can't tell you that," Margaret said from behind him. He turned. She was standing a few feet away, hands folded in front of her, watching him with those steady dark eyes. She looked as tired as he felt, which meant she looked like she'd been through something, but she was standing straight and her eyes were clear. "It might not be enough," she said. "I won't lie to you about that." "But you believe in this land," he said. "I believe in what's under this land," she said. "The inspector might not be looking for what we found. He might be looking for what everyone else has been looking for: surface results. Fast returns. Something that looks like a solved problem, instead of a problem in the process of being solved." "Then I'll have to change what he's looking for," Caleb said. She looked at him. "How?" "By explaining it," he said. "By showing him the channel, the source. By making him understand that what we've done in 2 weeks is the foundation of something that lasts, not a quick fix, not a gamble, but a structural change to how this land produces water." He paused. "You'll need to help me explain it." Something shifted in her expression. "Me. You understand it better than I do," he said simply. "The inspector will have questions I won't be able to answer as well as you can. He needs to understand the soil composition, the aquifer structure, The grade calculations, all of it. And you're the one who mapped it. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her process what he was asking, not just the technical part, but the other part. The part where she stood up in front of a banker's representative and spoke with authority about something she knew and someone else doubted. The part where she made herself visible in exactly the way she'd spent years learning to avoid. "They won't want to hear it from me," she said. Her voice was factual, not self-pitying. A woman explaining hydrology to a bank inspector in 1881. "Then we'll make them hear it anyway," Caleb said. "I'll be right there, every word. But it needs to come from you." Another silence. He held her gaze and didn't look away because he wanted her to understand that he meant it not as a tactic, not as the most convenient option, but because it was right. "All right," she said finally. "Then I'll talk." He nodded once. "Good." He turned back to look at the green edge of the field, small and stubborn, and alive against the dry expanse of everything surrounding it. "Caleb." Her voice came from behind him, quieter than before. He turned. "Thank you," she said. "For—" She stopped, found the words. "For asking me, instead of just using what I know without another stop. For asking me." "You shouldn't have to thank me for that," he said. She shook her head very slightly. "You'd be surprised," she said. "How rare it is." He looked at her for a moment. He wanted to say something that would be adequate to what she'd just said, and to the fact that she'd said it, the long, quiet weight behind it. He didn't have the words yet, so he just nodded, and she nodded back, and they stood together in the last of the day's light, and looked at the small living green of what they'd built. The inspector arrived the following morning. His name was Arthur Vance, and he came from Helena in a clean suit and a skeptical expression, which was probably the required equipment for a man whose job was telling people their land wasn't worth what they needed it to be worth. He was 50-something, professionally polite, in the way that has nothing to do with warmth, and he came with a ledger and two other men who had the look of people paid to agree with whatever he said. Franklin Dunmore was there too. He arrived separately 15 minutes after the inspector and positioned himself at a careful and deniable distance. Not part of the official inspection, but present, available, a gravitational suggestion. Caleb met them in the yard with his hat on straight and his handshake firm. "Mr. Whitaker," Vance said, "I'm sorry about the accelerated timeline. The board felt—" "No need to explain," Caleb said pleasantly. "We're ready for you. Come on and let me show you what we've been doing." He caught the quick look Vance exchanged with one of his men. The "what has he been doing" look. The look of a man who had expected to find nothing good and was adjusting his expression to accommodate the possibility that something good was possible while still maintaining professional skepticism. Caleb walked them to the channels first. Margaret was already there, standing at the head of the main channel with her grade notes in hand, looking exactly as she always looked. Calm, present, entirely certain about what she knew, without needing to announce it. She wore a clean dress, dark gray, and she'd done her hair properly, but she was the same woman she'd been for 2 weeks in the mud and the hard work, and there was no mistaking that. Vance looked at her with the particular blankness that meant assessment. Then he looked at Caleb. "This is Margaret Ellis," Caleb said. "She's the researcher who identified the underground water source and designed the recovery system." "Researcher," Vance said. The word landed neutrally. "Agricultural researcher," Caleb said. Her father was Robert Ellis, whose work on subsurface aquifer mapping was published through the University of Philadelphia. "She's been working this land for 2 weeks, and she's the reason we have what I'm about to show you." He heard a small sound from Dunmore's direction. He ignored it. Vance looked at Margaret again. "Miss Ellis." "Mr. Vance," she said. Her voice was clear and perfectly steady. "If you'll follow me, I'll show you the source point first. That'll make the grade system easier to understand once you've seen where the water originates." A pause. Then Vance nodded and followed her. She was extraordinary. Caleb had known it, but watching her explain the aquifer system to Vance was something different from knowing it. She was precise and patient, and she pitched her explanation at exactly the right level, not condescending, not over-technical, building from what a banker would already understand toward what he needed to understand. She showed him the grade calculations on paper and then showed him the physical grade on the ground, so he could see that the numbers matched the reality. She answered his questions before he finished asking them, and when one of his men said something skeptical about the projected recovery timeline, she turned to face the man directly and said, "The Edgefield data gives us a 90-day projection for the first quadrant. I'll show you the comparable soil composition studies that support that estimate, and you can bring in your own geologist to verify the aquifer measurements independently if you'd prefer. I'd recommend it, actually. It'll give you a cleaner basis for your report." Caleb watched Vance's expression move through several phases during that speech. Surprise, recalibration, something that was beginning to look like genuine interest. They walked to the edge fields. Vance stood at the border of the recovered section and looked at the thin green grass for a long moment without speaking. 2 weeks, he said. 12 days from first water contact, Margaret said. That rate of growth is consistent with the soil type and the water volume we're currently running. Over the next 90 days, with full channel operation. The recovery timeline, Vance said. Walk me through it. She did. She walked him through 90 days, then 6 months, then a year, with numbers that were conservative enough to be credible and specific enough to be meaningful. Caleb listened and filled in the ranching logistics when Vance asked herd recovery carrying capacity, the market projections for beef prices out of Helena. And between the two of them, they built a picture that was accurate and possible, and considerably more alive than anything the bank had been expecting to hear about Willow Creek Ranch. At one point, Dunmore said from his careful distance, "Of course, this is all highly speculative at this stage." "Mr. Dunmore." Vance didn't look at him. "You're here as an observer. You're welcome to wait by the wagons if you'd find that more comfortable." Dunmore went very quiet. Caleb did not permit himself any visible reaction to that, but he felt it. The inspection took 3 hours. At the end of it, Vance stood in the yard with his ledger and made notes for a long time without saying anything. Caleb stood with his arms at his sides and waited, and did not ask questions, and did not fill the silence, because filling a silence that needed to breathe was a way of making things worse. Margaret stood a few feet away and also waited. And the thing about her waiting was that it had no anxiety in it. Or if the anxiety was there, she had put it somewhere private and far down, where it didn't show in her hands or her face, or the set of her shoulders. Caleb found that steadied him. He wasn't sure she knew that, but it did. Finally, Vance closed the ledger. "The bank's position," he said, "is that a 60-day extension on the current note is justified given the demonstrated water recovery and the projected production timeline. We'll require monthly progress reports and access for a follow-up inspection at 30 days. A 60-day extension." Caleb breathed out slowly enough that it didn't look like the thing it was, which was 2 years of held breath releasing at once. "That's acceptable," he said. His voice came out steady. He was proud of that. "Miss Ellis," Vance turned to her. "The aquifer documentation you've prepared, I'd like a copy for the bank's file. It's..." He paused, and it was the pause of a man choosing words with some care. "It's thorough work." "I'll have it ready by this afternoon," Margaret said. "No pride, no performance. Just the plain competence of someone stating what they'll do and meaning it." Vance shook Caleb's hand and climbed into his wagon. His 2 men followed. He didn't acknowledge Dunmore, which was itself a kind of statement. Dunmore stood in the yard for a moment longer than he needed to, looking at Caleb with the expression of a man recalculating. Then he said, 60 days changes nothing in the end, Whitaker. The land was dying before she got here, and it'll go back to dying once the novelty wears off." Caleb looked at him levelly. "You're welcome to your opinion, Franklin. I thank you for coming all this way to share it." He held the man's gaze with a very particular steadiness. "Now you have yourself a good ride back to town." It was the most polite dismissal he'd ever delivered, and they both understood exactly what it was. Dunmore left. The yard was quiet. Pete had appeared from somewhere during the final exchange and was now standing near the barn with his hat in his hands, and Horace was beside him, and neither of them was pretending to be doing anything except witnessing what had just happened. Caleb turned to Margaret. She was still standing exactly where she'd been watching him. 60 days, he said. "Yes," she said. "That's enough time." "Yes," she said again. It is. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the exchange of information. Then he said, "You want coffee?" She made that laugh sound again, the surprised rusty one he'd now heard 3 times, and was beginning to understand was something she didn't give easily. "Yes," she said. "I believe I do." They went inside. Pete and Horace exchanged a look in the yard behind them. Pete opened his mouth. Horace shook his head once firmly, and Pete closed it, and they went back to work. The coffee was strong and too hot, and neither of them cared. They sat across the kitchen table from each other and drank it in silence for a while. The good kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. "You didn't have to tell him your father's name," Margaret said eventually. "It was relevant information," Caleb said. "You told him it so he'd take me seriously." He looked at her over his cup. "Is that a complaint?" A pause. "No," she said. "It's no. I just—" She turned her cup in her hands, a gesture he recognized now as the thing she did when she was working out what she wanted to say instead of just saying the first thing. People generally don't do that. Think about what a woman might need to be heard. They either hear her or they don't, and they don't engineer the conditions. "Your father engineered the conditions," Caleb said. She looked up at him. Something moved through her face. "Yes," she said quietly. "He did." "Then he was right about that too," Caleb said. "Same as everything else." She looked at him for a long moment. Not the evaluating look she'd given him when she first arrived, measuring how much to say, calculating the risk. A different kind of looking. Straighter. More open. The look of someone who has been given something unexpected and is still deciding whether they're allowed to accept it. "You're a strange man, Caleb Whitaker," she said finally. "I've been called worse," he said. "I don't mean it as an insult." "I know you don't." Another silence. Then she said, "I want to start on the second quadrant this week. If we can get channels to the north section in the first 30 days. "Margaret." She stopped. "We have 60 days, he said. "And it's 3 in the afternoon, and we've been running at full speed for 2 weeks, and the inspector just left 20 minutes ago." He said it gently. "Drink your coffee." She looked at him. Then she looked at her cup. Then she drank her coffee. He watched the tension in her shoulders very slowly begin to ease the smallest increment, the way land thaws gradually from the surface inward, and felt something that he recognized much later that evening, lying awake, listening to the quiet of the house as the particular sensation of a man who has started caring about someone else's well-being more than he expected to, and isn't quite sure what to do with that yet, but isn't as afraid of it as he might have been a few weeks ago. The 60 days began. The work that filled them was hard and methodical and deeply satisfying in a way that Caleb hadn't felt about work in years. The satisfaction of building something that was going to last rather than patching something that was going to fail. Margaret's plan rolled out with the precision of a military campaign and the patience of someone who understood that land worked on its own schedule, not yours. And the best you could do was set up the conditions and then get out of the way. The second channel quadrant took 12 days. The third took 9 because they'd gotten better at it, more efficient, more practiced moving together with the wordless coordination of people who've learned each other's rhythms through weeks of shared physical work. Pete stopped asking permission and started making decisions that were right, which was the sign of someone who'd been taught something properly. Horace turned out to have a gift for this precise angle work that Margaret needed on the channel walls, which no one had known because no one had ever asked him to do anything that required that kind of precision before. The ranch grew green in strips and patches, section by section, the way a quilt comes together, not all at once, but steadily, each piece connected to the last. The cattle that were left began filling out. They moved differently. Their heads came up. People started noticing. Not all of them were kind about it. There were women in town who said things about Margaret that Caleb heard secondhand, and that made his jaw tighten. Comments about her appearance, about her presumption, about what they imagined the nature of the arrangement at the Whitaker Ranch must be if a woman was living and working that closely with a man. The comments were the particular kind of cruelty that community gossip specializes in, not dangerous enough to confront directly, but sharp enough to hurt if you were in the way of them. Margaret heard some of them too. He knew she did because he saw it in her face once or twice after a trip to town. The brief, careful blankness she pulled over herself like a coat when something had found its way past her defenses. But she didn't speak about it, and so he waited because he'd learned that she said things when she was ready and not before. One evening she came in from the south field and sat down at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a moment, which was unusual because she was normally already talking by the time she sat down about the next day's work or a calculation she'd been refining or something Pete had done that needed to be noted. "What happened?" Caleb said without looking up from the ledger he was working through. A pause. "Mrs. Dunmore was in front of the dry goods store today when I went for the seed order." He put his pen down. "She said—" Margaret stopped, then started again with the careful level voice she used when she was very carefully not letting something show. "She said that she felt sorry for the women of this valley having to explain to their daughters why a woman of my sort was being permitted to live and work unchaperoned at a man's ranch, that it set a poor example." A pause. She was loud enough for the 3 other women standing with her to hear every word. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" "Nothing," Margaret said. "I took my seed order and left." "That was probably wise." "Yes." She was looking at her hands on the table. "It doesn't mean it didn't—" She stopped. "I've been hearing variations of that my whole life, one form or another. Too much of this, too little of that, too presumptuous in certain ways, not enough of other ways." She pressed her palms flat on the table. "I usually don't let it matter. But today it did," Caleb said. A silence. "Today it did," she said. He got up from the table. She tracked the movement without looking at him directly. He went to the stove, poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of her, and sat back down. Then he said, "You want me to say something to Dunmore?" She looked up sharply. "Don't you dare." "Then what do you want?" She looked at him for a moment. The question seemed to surprise her, not the fact of being asked, but the directness of it. "What do you want?" As if that were a thing with a simple answer. "I want—" She stopped, started again. "I want it not to matter," she said. "I want to be the kind of person for whom it genuinely doesn't matter what women like Eleanor Dunmore think or say." "You're not." "No," she said. "I'm not." "Good," he said. She blinked. "That's good. It means you're human," he said. "People who genuinely don't care what anyone thinks of them are either sociopaths or liars, one or the other." He picked up his coffee. "It hurts you because you have sense enough to understand that being talked about is a real thing, with real consequences, not just words. That's not weakness, that's accuracy." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a genuinely unusual way to think about it. My mother used to say something similar," he said. "Took me 20 years to understand what she meant." "What did she say?" "She said the only people who claim not to be hurt by cruelty are people who've never been hurt by anything that matters." He turned his cup in his hands. She was a very clear-eyed woman. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." "She would have liked you," Caleb said, and then because he hadn't planned to say it, and it arrived too fast to stop. "She would have respected you enormously, actually. She had very little patience for people who don't use their minds, and very high regard for people who do." Something happened in Margaret's face, something that moved through it and left a mark the way weather moves through country and leaves it changed. "Caleb," she said. I don't—" She stopped. Her hands were still flat on the table, but something had shifted in the tension of them, something looser. "I don't know how to when someone is kind to me in that particular way. I don't always know what to do with it." He looked at her. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "It's not a problem that needs solving." She looked at him for another long moment. Her eyes were very direct, and also in that moment, very human, stripped of the particular managed quality. They often had the careful measuring of every word and gesture. Just her face, tired and honest and open in a way it wasn't usually open. "I'm not leaving when this is done," she said. "I thought I should say that." He held very still. "What?" "I said I wasn't going to leave when I arrived." She met his eyes. "I'm telling you, I was wrong about that." A pause. "What changed your mind?" he asked. His voice came out quieter than intended. She held his gaze. "Someone asked me what I wanted," she said, "and meant it." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight and felt something turn over in his chest with a slow and certain finality. The way the first real water had moved through the first channel quietly, inevitably going somewhere, it was always going to go. Outside the south fields were green in the dark. And at Willow Creek Ranch, for the first time in a very long time, the night felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. She hadn't left. That was the thing. Caleb kept coming back to, in the quiet moments between the work, the fact that she'd said it out loud, sitting across his kitchen table in the lamplight, with her hands flat on the wood and her eyes direct and honest, and the fact that she'd meant it. He knew she'd meant it because Margaret Ellis did not say things she didn't mean. 3 weeks of working alongside her had made that plain. Every word she spoke was load-bearing. There was no filler, no performance, no saying something because it was easier than silence. She was staying. He didn't examine what that meant too closely. Not yet. There was too much work, and the 60-day clock was running, and examining feelings was the kind of luxury a man in debt to a Helena bank couldn't properly afford. So he folded it up and put it somewhere safe and went back to work, and if he moved with something lighter in him than he'd had before, well, that was between him and the morning air. The 30-day inspection came on a Tuesday. Vance arrived without Dunmore this time, which was itself information. He walked the property with the same professionally neutral expression he'd worn the first time, asking questions and making notes. But Caleb had gotten better at reading the man, and he could see the difference. The way Vance's eyes moved across the green sections with a quality that wasn't skepticism anymore, something closer to recalibration. "Second quadrant's showing," Vance said, standing at the edge of the North Channel. 12 days ahead of the original projection, Margaret said. She was beside Caleb with her notebook, same as she'd been during the first inspection, same steadiness. "The soil composition on the north section absorbed faster than I estimated. The water table there is closer to the surface than the aquifer map suggested." "Better news than expected," Vance said. "Generally," she said, "the land has performed better than conservative projection. I try not to oversell in my initial estimates." Vance looked at her, then a different look than the first time, less assessment, and more something that was close to professional recognition. "Your documentation on the aquifer system was very complete, Miss Ellis. Our hydrology consultant looked it over." She held very still. And he wanted to know who you'd trained under," Vance said. "He'd like to correspond with you if that's acceptable. Said the capillary mapping method you used on the northern ridge was—" He consulted his notes. Innovative, his word. Something moved through Margaret's face that she caught and controlled almost instantly, but Caleb was standing close enough to see it happen. The flash of something raw and unguarded. The particular emotion of a person who has been told their work is good by someone qualified to say so, which sounds simple but isn't not when you've spent years being told the opposite. "That would be acceptable," she said. Her voice was entirely level. She was very good. Vance nodded, wrote something down, and moved on to the next section. Caleb leaned slightly toward her as they followed. "You all right?" he said low. "Perfectly fine," she said, in the tone that meant she needed a minute. He gave her the minute. The inspection ended with Vance confirming the 60-day note would stand, and hinting carefully in the qualified language of bank officials who don't like to commit to things before they have to, that a full loan restructure was not out of the question, given current trajectory. Current trajectory. Caleb shook the man's hand and watched him leave and stood in the yard and felt the ground under him feel for the first time in 2 years solid. It lasted about 4 hours. The man arrived that afternoon on a roan horse that moved like money, which was Caleb's first indication that something was wrong. He was 60 or so, silver-haired, wearing a good suit that had been impractical for the road and didn't care with the ease of someone who has never had to care about practicality because practicality was something other people handled. His name, he said when Caleb met him in the yard, was Harold Weston. "I'm an attorney," Weston said. "Out of Philadelphia. I represent a consortium of business interests in the matter of the estate of Dr. Robert Ellis, deceased. The yard got very quiet. Caleb was aware of Margaret behind him on the porch, where she'd come when she heard the horse. He was aware of her going very still. "I'm not sure what brings you to my property, Mr. Weston," Caleb said. He kept his voice level. He kept his body very easy weight balanced, the way his father had taught him to stand when someone was trying to make you feel small. "I'm here to speak with a woman traveling under the name Margaret Ellis," Weston said. "I have reason to believe she's residing here." "Traveling under the name," Caleb said. "That's an interesting way to put it. Most people just call it their name. Sir, this is a legal matter, and I'd appreciate—" "Mr. Weston." Caleb's voice stayed pleasant. "You've ridden onto my property unannounced and started making statements about a member of my household. Before we go any further with this conversation, I'd like to understand what exactly you want." A pause. Weston recalibrated. "There are certain documents and research materials in Miss Ellis's possession that belong properly to the consortium I represent. Materials that were part of Dr. Ellis's professional estate and were improperly retained upon his death." "Improperly retained," Caleb said. "Taken," Weston said, dropping the softening. "The consortium has been looking for her for 2 years. I can speak for myself." Margaret's voice came from behind Caleb, and it was the clearest and most unafraid he had ever heard it. He stepped to the side, not back to the side, staying close, and she came down off the porch and stood in the yard with Weston looking at her. If she was frightened, and Caleb thought she was, it was entirely below the surface. What was on the surface was the look he'd seen on her face on the rocky ridge the day the water came up certain direct done with hiding. "Mr. Weston," she said, "I know who you represent. I've been expecting you for 2 years. What I didn't expect was that you'd come this far to repeat a lie in person, when it's been working just fine in writing." Weston's expression sharpened. "Miss Ellis, I would advise—" "My father's research journals are mine," she said. "His field notes are mine. The capillary mapping method that your consortium filed a patent on 6 months after his death was developed by him and documented by me, and I have the original dated notebooks to prove it. All of them. I kept them." She paused. "Did your clients tell you I kept them?" A silence. Caleb watched Weston's face and saw something happen in it. A small recalibration, the kind that meant information had landed that hadn't been expected. "The materials were part of the professional estate," Weston said, but the authority had shifted slightly. "The materials were in my possession before my father died," Margaret said. "He gave them to me. Not because he was dying, but because they were my work as much as his, and he knew it, and he wanted to make sure there was a record that couldn't be taken." She held the man's gaze. "He knew what your clients would try to do. He told me they would try. He made me promise to keep the notebooks and keep moving and not stop until I found somewhere I could stand still and fight." "This is a substantial legal claim," Weston started. "Yes," she said. "It is. And I have a substantial legal record to support it. Original notebooks dated in my father's hand and mine, corresponding with publication dates that predate your consortium's patent application by 4 years." She paused again. "You've traveled a long way, Mr. Weston. Would you like a cup of coffee while you consider your next step?" Weston looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb, as if looking for something there that would shift the equation. Caleb looked back at him with his most pleasant and completely immovable expression. "I'll be in Harlow Creek for 2 days," Weston said finally. "I'll need to correspond with my clients." "Of course," Margaret said. "You know where to find me." Weston mounted his horse and rode back down the access road. Caleb watched him go and didn't say anything until the sound of the hooves was gone. Then he turned to Margaret. She was standing exactly as she'd been standing, still and straight, watching the road. And then very slowly, she let out a breath that came from somewhere deep down. The kind of breath that means something held for a very long time is being released. "You kept the notebooks," Caleb said. "My father told me to keep them," she said. "He said—" Her voice was steady, but something was working at the edge of it. "He said that knowledge is only as powerful as the evidence it leaves behind. Keep everything. Every date, every entry, every calculation. Keep it in your own hand so no one can say you weren't there. He was preparing you. Yes, she said. He knew he was dying, and he knew what they would do, and he spent the last year of his life making sure I had what I would need to fight them. She paused. I just didn't know where to fight from. Until now. Caleb looked at her. You're going to fight them. I was always going to fight them, she said. I just needed somewhere to stand. He held her gaze for a long moment and felt something move through his chest, something that was pride and protectiveness, and something else underneath both of those that he wasn't going to name yet, because the moment was too serious for naming things. You've got somewhere to stand, he said. She looked at him. Just looked at him for a long, still moment that held more than either of them would have known how to say. Then she nodded once. I know, she said. The next 2 days were the longest Caleb had lived through since the bank deadline. He didn't say so because Margaret seemed to need the appearance of calm, and he wasn't going to undermine that, but he was acutely aware of Weston in town, of correspondence, moving between Harlow Creek and Philadelphia, of the particular invisible weight of legal machinery being decided somewhere far away by men who had resources Margaret couldn't match and a strong interest in a specific outcome. Mud sure she knew he wasn't going anywhere. I didn't say it directly. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed saying directly, and Margaret wasn't the kind of person who responded to direct declarations with anything except discomfort. Instead, he stayed close. He was present at breakfast and at supper and in the evenings, and when she worked through the numbers on her notebook at the kitchen table. He sat across from her with his ledger, and when she went quiet, he let the quiet be comfortable and didn't fill it with reassurance she hadn't asked for. On the second evening, she looked up from her notebook and said, He's going to come back with a compromise offer. You think so? The notebooks changed the math, she said. If I can demonstrate prior publication dates, the patent is vulnerable. Not just their claim to my father's work, their whole filing. It opens them up to a challenge that could invalidate years of what they've built on his research. She turned her pen in her hand. They don't want a court case. They want me to go away quietly. The compromise will be their attempt to buy that. What will they offer? She thought about it. Money, she said. Probably a significant amount. And a legal agreement that I won't pursue the patent challenge. And what are you going to say? She met his eyes. That depends, she said. On what? On what they offer, she said. I'm not unreasonable. If they want to settle, I'll listen. But I wanted on paper that the research was my father's and mine both. That my name goes back on the original work. She paused. That's not about money. That's about the record. I want the record to be accurate. That's a fair thing to want, he said. Some people would say it's not worth fighting for, that the money's more practical. Some people, he said, have never had anything taken from them that mattered more than money. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said quietly. They haven't. Weston came back on the morning of the third day. He came alone this time without the bearing of someone on official business, which Caleb recognized as deliberate. He met them in the yard, and he had a different quality than 2 days ago, less authority, more negotiation. My clients have authorized me to make an offer, he said. All right, Margaret said. He named a figure. It was substantial. Caleb kept his face entirely neutral. It was enough to pay off the ranch debt with money left over. He didn't look at Margaret. Margaret said, and the attribution. Weston paused. A private acknowledgement in the consortium's records that Dr. Ellis contributed significantly to the relevant research. No, she said immediately. Miss Ellis. Public attribution, she said. Robert Ellis and Margaret Ellis. Both names on the original research record corrected and refiled. In the public record. Not a private acknowledgement, a public correction. She paused. And the figure you named is a starting point, not a final number. Weston looked at her steadily. You understand you'd be going against men with considerable resources. Yes, she said. I'm aware of that. A legal challenge would take years and cost, Mr. Weston. She said his name calmly the way she said everything. I'm not asking for a fight. I'm asking for the truth. Those are different things, and if your clients understand that this will be straightforward. She paused. If they don't, then yes, it will take years. And the notebooks will still say what they say. Another silence. Weston looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked back at her. "I'll need to send another telegram," he said. "There's a telegraph office in town," Caleb said pleasantly. "Open until 6. Weston went to town. He came back the following morning with a number that was twice the original figure and language that included both names. Margaret read it 3 times. Caleb read it once and understood enough to know that the important parts were there. She asked for one change, a specific phrase about the capillary mapping methodology that Weston wrote down and agreed to convey without argument, which told Caleb the clients were done negotiating. She signed it. Weston left Harlow Creek by noon. Margaret stood in the yard after his wagon disappeared, and for a moment she didn't move. Then she turned around and walked to the edge of the south field, the original green section. The first one, the one they'd stood in together on the 12th day, and she stood at its edge and put her face down in her hands, not crying, or not only crying. Caleb wasn't sure what to call it. The sound she made was brief and hard and real. The sound of someone releasing something that had been held so tight for so long that the body doesn't quite know what to do when it's finally gone. He walked over and stood beside her and didn't say anything. Didn't put a hand on her shoulder. Just stood there close enough that she knew he was there. After a minute, she lifted her face and turned it toward the sky and took a long breath. 4 years, she said. Her voice was raw. "Yeah," he said. 4 years I've been carrying that, and now it's just—" She stopped. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. They stood there for another minute in the quiet of the south field. Then she said without looking at him, "The second quadrant channels need the east wall reinforced. I noticed a soft section yesterday." Haimada sound that he quickly converted into a cough. "We can look at that this afternoon." "I want to look at it now," she said. "I want to work." "All right," he said. "Let's go work." She wiped her face with her sleeve, businesslike and final, and turned and walked to the second quadrant. He followed her. And if the line of her shoulders was different than it had been before, lighter. Somehow the way a person carries themselves differently when they've put down something heavy. Well, neither of them said so, and the east wall needed reinforcing, and there was work to do. The news about Weston's visit and its outcome moved through Harlow Creek the way news always moves through a small town, at the speed of interest, which is faster than any horse. By the following Sunday, everyone who wanted to know knew or thought they knew, which is a different thing entirely. What they thought they knew was that a woman nobody had heard of a month ago had somehow beaten a Philadelphia legal firm. The versions ranged from impressive to wildly exaggerated, and Caleb heard most of them secondhand via Pete, who had an inexhaustible appetite for town gossip, now that the town was gossiping about people he knew. "They're saying she's got journals full of patents worth $100,000, Pete reported at breakfast. "That's not accurate," Margaret said without looking up from her coffee. "They're also saying she threatened to take the case to the federal court in Helena if they didn't settle." "Also not accurate," she said. "Well, what actually happened?" She looked up at him. "I told them the truth and showed them the evidence to support it, and they decided that was worth taking seriously." Pete thought about that. "That's less exciting than what they're saying." "Most things are," she said. "What the gossip did, regardless of its accuracy, was shift the way people in town looked at Margaret when she came in for supplies. Not all the way there were women who still held their mouths in that particular way when she passed, and there were men who still said things under their breath. But the angle of it had changed. There was a new quality in some of the looks, something that wasn't friendliness exactly, but was the frontier of it, the border territory between skepticism and respect. Caleb noticed it. He thought she noticed it too, though she didn't say so. What she said one afternoon, about 3 weeks after Weston left, was, "Someone came to see me at the dry goods store today." He looked up from the ledger. "Who?" "A farmer, name of Alderson. He's got land about 7 miles north along the ridge." She set down her things and came to sit at the table. "He's having the same problem we had. The surface reads dry and dead, and his family's been working it wrong because they didn't know what to look for." "And he came to you." He heard about the aquifer work, she said. He heard about Vance's inspection. She paused. He asked if I'd look at his land. Caleb set his pen down. What did you tell him? I told him I'd need to discuss it, she said. With you. He looked at her. Why with me? Because I'm working here, she said. I'm not going to take on something that pulls from this place without talking to you first. He thought about that. Thought about what it meant that she'd said it. The shape of it, the way it assumed a partnership, a shared interest, and accountability that ran in both directions. Go look at his land, Caleb said. You're sure? If you can help him the way you helped this place, he said, you should help him. That's not a question. He paused. I'll come with you if you want. She looked at him for a moment. I'd like that, she said. Yes. They rode out to Alderson's land on a Friday, and Margaret walked his ridgeline with the same methodical attention she'd given Willow Creek's rocky western edge, pausing and crouching and marking and thinking in that particular way of hers that looked like nothing until you understood what was being calculated. Alderson was a weathered man in his 50s with 3 grown sons and the particular defeated look of someone who'd been fighting for too long. He watched her work with an expression that moved gradually from skeptical to something more open, the same trajectory Caleb recognized from watching his own face do it 6 weeks ago. There, she said finally at a point along his north fence line. You've got a secondary source here, smaller than the Whitaker aquifer but enough, more than enough for the acreage you're working. Alderson looked at her. He looked at the ground. He looked at his oldest son who was standing nearby. Then he looked back at her. How sure are you? He said. Dig 3 feet down right here, she said. And then we'll talk about how sure I am. They dug. And what came up made Alderson's oldest son make a sound that was half a laugh and half something else entirely. And Alderson himself took off his hat and held it against his chest and didn't say anything for a long moment. How much? Alderson finally said. Not about money, about water. Enough, Margaret said again. It'll take work, but it's there, it's been there. On the ride, back to Willow Creek. Margaret was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Not working through a problem quiet. Something more reflective. What are you thinking? Caleb said. I'm thinking about how many pieces of land in this valley are dying for the same reason this one nearly died, she said. Not because the land is bad, because no one knows how to read it. He rode alongside her and let her think. There's a systematic approach, she said slowly. A way to map the whole watershed, to identify the aquifer network across the whole region. She was watching the road, but seeing something else. It would take time, a real survey. But if you could map the underground water across this whole country, how many ranches and farms could that save? That's a significant undertaking, he said. Yes, she said. I know. You'd need resources, he said. Equipment, people who know what they're doing. Yes. And the consortium settlement, he said carefully, provided some of those resources. She looked at him then. Yes, she said. It did. He held her gaze for a moment, riding steady beside her. Then I think you know what you want to do next. She looked back at the road. I need to finish what I started here first, she said. You have, he said. In every way that matters. She shook her head slightly. There are still 2 quadrants to full function, and the cattle count needs to be up before the 60-day note converts, and the northern fence line needs... Margaret. He said her name quietly. She stopped. The ranch is going to be all right, he said. You know that. A pause. I know that, she said. So stop hiding behind the work, he said. And tell me what you actually want. She looked at him sharply. Then the sharpness eased. She turned back to the road again and didn't say anything for a moment. I want to do both, she said. The survey and here. I don't want to have to choose. Then don't, he said. She looked at him again. That's not as simple as you're making it sound. No, he agreed. It isn't simple, but simple and possible aren't the same thing. She studied his face for a long moment, the way she did sometimes, the way that meant she was seeing him clearly and hadn't yet decided what to do with what she saw. "You're an interesting man," she said. "You told me I was strange," he said. "I believe that was your word." "Strange and interesting aren't mutually exclusive," she said. He smiled. She looked away, but not before he saw the corner of her mouth move. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and the light was long and golden over the green sections of the ranch as they came down the access road. And it looked, Caleb thought. In a moment, he would not share because it would have embarrassed him. It looked like somewhere that was going to last. The crisis arrived the way all the real ones do, without warning at the worst possible time, from a direction no one had been watching. It was Pete, who came running from town, hat and hand dust on his boots, looking like someone who'd ridden hard to get there. Caleb was in the south field with Margaret going over the cattle rotation schedule, when the boy came over the ridge at a pace that made both of them stop. "What happened?" Caleb said. Pete was still catching his breath. He handed over a piece of paper, a copy of something a legal notice. Caleb could see that before he read it. "Dunmore," Pete said. "He filed a property claim with the county. Says the western ridge section where the aquifer source is, isn't inside your deed boundary. Says it was surveyed wrong in 1849, and the source point falls 200 feet outside the Whitaker line." The south field went very silent. Caleb read the notice. He read it twice. The language was precise and technical, and clearly written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "If that's true," he said slowly, "if the source point isn't on our land." "The channels are useless," Margaret said. Her voice was flat and controlled, and gave nothing away. "The water right reverts to whoever holds the land outside the boundary." "Which Dunmore would purchase immediately," Caleb said. "He's already filed a purchase intent with the county recorder," Pete said miserably. "Filed it the same day as the claim. He's been planning this for weeks, maybe longer." Caleb stood in his south field, the green south field, the living proof of what they'd built, and felt something cold move through him. Felt the ground under him shift in a way it hadn't shifted in 60 days. He looked at Margaret. She was looking at the notice in his hand, not at him. "Is it possible," he said, "the survey error?" "It's possible," she said carefully. "The 1849 surveys in this region they weren't always precise. The equipment wasn't what it is now, and the men doing them weren't always—" She stopped. "It's possible." "But," he said, because he could hear there was one. She looked up at him. "The source point isn't where Dunmore's claim says it is," she said slowly. He stared at her. "What?" "I moved the excavation," she said. 2 feet north of my original mark, because the grade angle was better and it gave us more pressure. The point where the water came up." She paused. "I need to see the original survey map and Dunmore's claim document side by side. But if I'm right—" She stopped again. "If you're right," Caleb said. "If I'm right," she said, "then the source point is inside your boundary by approximately 40 feet. And Dunmore's legal team is challenging a location that doesn't match where the actual excavation was made." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Get your notebooks." "Already thinking it," she said, and was moving before he finished the sentence. They worked through the night. Margaret spread every map across the kitchen table and rebuilt the survey from the original 1849 document forward, overlaying her own grade calculations and her excavation notes with the precise coordinates she'd recorded on the day they dug. Caleb sat across from her and held the lamp steady when she needed more light, and asked questions when something wasn't clear, and watched her build the case, the way he'd watched her build everything else methodically, thoroughly, without drama, with total certainty about what she knew and total precision about how she documented it. At 3 in the morning, she put her pen down and looked up. "The source point is 43 feet inside the Whitaker boundary," she said. "I can prove it with the excavation records, the grade calculations, and the original survey, overlaid with the county recorder's benchmark measurements from 1871. She paused. "Dunmore's claim references a point that is 200 feet outside the boundary, but that point doesn't correspond to where the water is. His own surveyors marked the wrong location." "Deliberately," Caleb said. She held his gaze. "Either deliberately," she said, or because no one told them exactly where the excavation was, because they assumed it was at my original mark before I moved it. She paused. And I never published my adjustment notes anywhere except my own notebook. Caleb sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her. So the thing that makes this beatable, he said, is the adjustment you made for a better grade angle. Yes, she said. That you made because you were thinking about water pressure. Yes. Not because of anything to do with the survey line. Not even slightly, she said. He shook his head slowly. Your father told you to keep everything. My father told me to keep everything, she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table at 3 a.m. with maps spread between them and the lamp burning low, and both of them too tired and too wired to sleep, and he said, Margaret. She looked at him. This is the last time, he said. The last time someone tries to take what's yours. I need you to understand that I mean that. She went very still. Caleb, I mean it, he said. We're going to walk those documents into the county recorder's office tomorrow morning, and we're going to file a response to Dunmore's claim with every calculation and every notebook page you have, and we're going to make it so clear and so complete that there is no angle left from which this looks like anything except what it is, a man trying to steal water that isn't his. He held her gaze. And then we're going to be done with this particular fight. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were tired and bright, at the same time the eyes of someone who has been through too much tonight and is still somehow present. All right, she said. Her voice was quiet. All right. Get a couple hours sleep, he said. We leave at first light. She started gathering the papers, carefully handling them with the practiced care of someone who'd been protecting them for 4 years. He held the lamp for her and watched her hands move over the documents. Her father's handwriting mixed with hers, dates and calculations, and the careful record of everything they'd discovered together. He would have liked you, she said suddenly. He looked up. She was looking at the papers, not at him. Your father, he said. Yes. She didn't look up. He had a very specific idea of what a good man looked like, not what he accomplished, not what he owned, the way he treated people when there was nothing in it for him. She paused. I think about that sometimes. What he would have thought of someone. She finally looked up and met his eyes. He would have liked you. Caleb held her gaze and held the lamp steady and said the truest thing he knew. I hope to deserve that, he said. She nodded once. Then she took the papers to her room and he extinguished the lamp and the house went dark, and outside the green fields were quiet under a sky full of stars. And in the morning they would go fight the last fight, and Caleb lay in his bed with the certainty of it settled in his chest, like something permanent, not the certainty of winning, though he believed they would win, but the certainty of not being alone in it. That was the thing that had changed. That was the thing that was going to hold. They left before sunrise. Margaret had the notebooks in a canvas satchel that she held against her side with both hands, the way a person carries something they cannot afford to lose. Caleb drove the wagon and didn't try to fill the silence, and she didn't ask him to. The road to Harlow Creek was empty at that hour, the air cool and sharp, the way Montana mornings were, even in the middle of summer, and the only sound was the horses and the wheels and the occasional distant call of something waking up in the grass. I thought about what she'd said the night before, about her father, about what a good man looked like to a man like Robert Ellis. He turned it over in his mind, the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling the weight of it. I didn't feel like a good man particularly. He felt like a man who was tired and angry and had 43 feet of survey measurement standing between his family's land and the longest shadow Franklin Dunmore had yet managed to cast. But he supposed that was exactly the kind of moment her father would have been watching for. Not the easy ones, the ones where doing right cost something. He drove a little faster. The county recorder's office opened at 8. They were at the door at 7:45, and when the clerk unlocked it and found Caleb Whitaker and a woman he'd never seen before standing on the step with a canvas satchel and expressions that meant business, he had the good sense to simply step aside and let them in. I need to file a formal response to a property claim, Caleb said. Claim number. He pulled Dunmore's notice from his coat. 47-81 filed by Franklin Dunmore 3 days ago. The clerk found the file. He set it on the counter. Margaret opened her satchel and began laying out documents beside it, with the careful precision of someone who has rehearsed this moment, not in a theatrical way, but the way a person rehearses something they've needed to do for a long time and finally can. "The claim challenges the boundary at the western ridge," she said to the clerk, not to Caleb, because the clerk was the one who needed to understand this. Specifically, it asserts that the excavation point for the Whitaker water source falls outside the deeded boundary by approximately 200 feet, citing a survey discrepancy in the original 1849 document. The clerk looked at her, then at Caleb, then back at her. "She knows what she's talking about," Caleb said pleasantly. "Keep listening." Margaret set the excavation notebook open to the entry, dated 3 weeks after she'd arrived. "This is the original excavation record," she said. "Date, location, grade measurements, and the adjustment note here." She pointed to the entry, her finger precise on the page. "Documenting the 2-foot north shift in the excavation point made on this date for grade optimization. The coordinates for the actual source point as excavated and documented place it 43 feet inside the recorded Whitaker boundary, as established by the 1871 County Benchmark Survey." She laid the benchmark survey beside the notebook, then her grade calculation overlay, then the original 1849 document with her annotations marking the discrepancy between Dunmore's claimed coordinates and the actual excavation point. The clerk leaned over and looked at it for a long moment. "Mr. Dunmore's claim," Margaret said, "references coordinates that correspond to my original preliminary mark before the adjustment. That mark was never excavated. The actual source point, the one with water, is documented here and is 43 feet inside this boundary." She paused. "His surveyors appear to have measured to a mark that doesn't correspond to any actual excavation." The clerk looked up. "Can you leave these documents for the file?" "These are copies," Margaret said. She set a second set of pages beside the originals. "The originals stay with me." The clerk nodded and reached for the response form. "I'll need to notify Mr. Dunmore's attorney that a response has been filed." "Of course," Caleb said. "We'd expect nothing less." They were back on the street by 9:15. Caleb stood beside the wagon and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "That's it," he said. "That's the filing," she said. "The county surveyor will be dispatched to verify the coordinates. If the measurements match my documentation." "They will," he said. "Then the claim fails on its own merits," she said. "Dunmore's attorneys will know that before the surveyor goes out. They'll know it as soon as the clerk shows them the response." "So what happens next?" She held his gaze. "We wait," she said. "And we go home, and we work, because there are still 2 channel quadrants that need us more than this street does." He looked at her for another moment. Then he put his hand out and she looked at it with that particular expression, the one she got when someone did something she hadn't quite prepared for, and then she took it. A firm, brief, complete handshake. The kind between people who have done something together that mattered. "Let's go home," he said. She nodded. And for the first time, he noticed she didn't hesitate at the word. The county surveyor came out 4 days later. He was a taciturn man named Garrett, who had the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 30 years looking at the ground through measuring equipment, and he walked the western ridge with a level of focused attention that suggested he took his job seriously and would not be hurried about it. Caleb and Margaret walked with him. Dunmore's attorney, a young man from Helena who'd arrived the previous day, looking like someone who already suspected this trip was going to go badly, walked on the other side. Garrett measured. He re-measured. He checked his benchmark references. He crouched at the excavation point and took readings from 3 angles and wrote everything in his book without expression. Then he stood up and looked at his measurements and then at Dunmore's attorney and said, "The excavated source point is 41 feet inside the recorded Whitaker boundary. The coordinates in the filed claim do not correspond to this excavation point." Dunmore's attorney said nothing for a moment. Then, "There may be an error in the original survey. The 1871 benchmark is solid," Garrett said, in the tone of a man who did not appreciate implications about his profession. I checked it myself 6 years ago. The boundary is where the boundary is. He closed his book. I'll file my report with the county recorder by end of week. The attorney left that afternoon. Caleb didn't see him go, but Pete reported it with considerable satisfaction at supper. Rode out like someone was after him, Pete said. Didn't even stop at the hotel to collect his bag properly, just tied it to his saddle. Pete, Margaret said. Ma'am. Don't enjoy it too much, she said. But there was the corner of a smile at the edge of it that she didn't entirely manage to conceal. Pete grinned into his plate. After supper, Caleb found Margaret standing at the edge of the south field, in the long evening light, arms folded, looking out at the green with the particular quality of stillness that meant she was processing something rather than doing nothing. He came and stood beside her. It's over, he said. The claim is over, she said. Dunmore won't try again, he said. Not this way. He's been exposed as bringing a bad survey to the county recorder's office. That follows a man. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. It's not Dunmore I'm thinking about. What then? She turned her head to look at him. I keep waiting for the next thing, she said. The next problem. The next person who decides I have something they want, or something they need to diminish. She paused. I've been living in that mode for 4 years, and I don't entirely know how to stop. I thought about that carefully, because it deserved to be thought about carefully. I don't think you stop, he said. I think you just stop being alone in it. The waiting. She looked at him. That's... She stopped, started again. That's a meaningful distinction. Yeah, he said. I think it is. The sound of the cattle from the north section drifted over to them, the particular sound of animals that had enough to eat and water to drink a sound Caleb hadn't heard from this land in 2 years. He listened to it for a moment. The 60-day note converts next week, he said. Vance's office sent the new terms. The restructured loan is it's manageable, more than manageable. I saw the letter, she said. We're going to make it, he said. She looked back at the field. Yes, she said. We are. Something in the simplicity of it, that we settled in the air between them like something physical. Neither of them moved. Margaret, he said. Don't, she said. Quietly, not sharp. He looked at her profile. Don't what? She let out a slow breath. Don't say whatever you're about to say yet, she said. I need a little more time with things being what they currently are before they become something else. I was quiet for a moment. What are things currently? She glanced at him sideways. Good, she said. Things are currently good, and I am not accustomed to things being good, and I'd like to stand in it for a little while without moving it. He looked out at the field. Fair enough, he said. Don't take that as I'm not... She stopped. Tried again. I'm not saying I don't. She stopped again. I'm not good at this, she said. I know, he said. I'm not rushing you. A pause. Are you sure? Because most men in my experience... I'm not most men, he said. She was quiet. No, she said after a moment. You're genuinely not. They stood there in the evening light for a while longer, side by side, not quite touching, and both precisely aware of it. And the cattle made their good sound, and the green field held its color against the coming dark. And Caleb thought that he could stand here for a very long time, and not need anything else, which was itself a kind of answer to a question he hadn't quite finished asking. The next morning was when everything changed again. It wasn't Dunmore. It wasn't the bank. It wasn't any of the things Caleb had been braced for. It was a woman who arrived in a buggy at 10 in the morning. A woman in her 60s, well-dressed in the way of someone from a city who'd thought carefully about what to wear to the country, with a straight back and sharp eyes that reminded Caleb sharply and unexpectedly of Margaret. Margaret came out of the house at the sound of the buggy and went completely still on the porch. Aunt Clara, she said. The words came out in a voice Caleb had never heard from her before, stripped of everything, just the raw register of genuine shock. The woman got down from the buggy and looked up at Margaret with an expression that was trying to be composed and wasn't entirely making it. Margaret, she said. Then neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Margaret came down off the porch, and the older woman crossed the yard, and they stood close together, and Margaret's aunt put both hands on Margaret's face, and looked at her the way people look at someone they were afraid they'd lost and found again. "You are so like him," her aunt said. Her voice cracked on the last word. Caleb quietly stepped back and found something useful to do in the barn and gave them the yard. He stayed in the barn for 40 minutes. When he came back out, the two women were sitting on the porch with coffee, and whatever the first wave of reunion had been was over. And now they were talking in the lower, steady way of people who have a great deal to catch up on and are settling into the work of it. Margaret looked up when he came across the yard. "Caleb," she said, "this is my father's sister, Clara Whitfield. She's been trying to find me since—" She paused. "Since I heard what Jameson and his partners did," Clara said, and her voice went precise and cold on the name, in a way that told Caleb she had a full opinion about what had been done to her niece. "2 years looking. I only found you because of the consortium settlement. Your attorney filed the response through the Philadelphia courts, and your name was on the record. I was in Philadelphia last spring," Margaret said. Her voice had a complicated quality. "Working a kitchen job 3 blocks from Father's old office." Clara closed her eyes briefly. "I know," she said. "I found that out after. I was in Boston at the time." She opened her eyes. "I'm sorry it took so long." "You didn't know where I was," Margaret said. "I didn't want to be found." She paused. "By anyone." "I know," Clara said. A short silence. Then Clara looked at Caleb with those sharp eyes that knew things. "You're the rancher," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Margaret wrote to me," she said, "after the settlement. She told me about this place." She paused. "She told me about you." He looked at Margaret. She was looking at her coffee cup. "Did she?" he said. "She said you treated her work with respect," Clara said, "from almost the first day. She said—" She paused, seeming to choose. "She said you were the first person since her father who looked at her and saw what was actually there." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "She made that very easy," he said. Clara looked at him for another long, steady moment. He had the feeling of being evaluated in a way that was serious and complete. Then she nodded once the way Margaret nodded, precise and final. "I brought some of Robert's things," Clara said to Margaret. "The items the consortium didn't get. Some personal letters, his original field sketches, a few instruments. I've been keeping them since he died. I didn't know who else to keep them for." Margaret set her coffee cup down very carefully. "His field sketches," she said. "Yes." "His the ones from the Western surveys." "All of them," Clara said. "Everything he didn't file formally. The working drawings." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Those were the ones he said had never been fully analyzed," she said. Her voice had dropped to something careful and intent. "He thought there were at least 3 more major aquifer systems documented in those sketches that no one had followed up on." "I know," Clara said. "He told me that too." They looked at each other across the porch, and Caleb watched something pass between them. The particular communication of 2 people who loved the same man and understood what his unfinished work meant. "Can I see them?" Margaret said. Clara stood up immediately. "I'll get the case." She went to the buggy. Caleb looked at Margaret. She was sitting very straight, both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and her eyes were bright with something that wasn't quite tears and wasn't quite excitement and was probably both at once. "Your aunt," he said. "She was closer to my father than anyone," Margaret said. "She's the one who convinced him I could do the work. When I was young and he wasn't sure women could study science the way men did, she told him he was being an idiot." A pause. "She was right. She usually right. Infuriatingly often," Margaret said. Clara came back with a flat leather case that had been expensive once and was now well worn from travel. She set it on the small table between them and opened it, and inside were drawings, large paper sheets folded carefully covered in the intricate layered lines of a researcher's field sketches, with handwriting in the margins that Margaret recognized instantly because it was the handwriting she'd grown up reading. She reached out and put her hand on the top sheet without unfolding it and held it there. Clara put her hand over Margaret's, just for a moment. Then Margaret unfolded the first sketch, and the two of them bent over it together, and Caleb went inside and put the coffee on again and let them have it. Clara stayed 3 days. She slept in the spare room and ate at the kitchen table and walked the ranch with Margaret in the mornings, learning what had been done here, asking questions that were specific and informed the questions of someone who understood the science and was genuinely interested in how Margaret had applied it. She and Caleb settled into a comfortable courtesy that by the second day had the quality of people who've decided they like each other and don't need to make a production of it. On the second evening, Clara found him in the barn, checking the harness on the working horses, a job that didn't strictly need doing right then, but gave his hands something to do while his mind ran. "She told me she's not leaving," Clara said without any preamble. He kept working the harness. "She told me that too," he said. "What did you say?" "I didn't say anything," he said. "It didn't seem like something that needed a response. It seemed like something that needed to just be." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You know what she's been through," she said. "Not all of it, but enough." "Enough," he agreed. "She doesn't trust easily," Clara said. "What looks like trust from Margaret is it took years to build with her father, decades with me." She paused. "Whatever she's shown you in 2 months, that's not nothing. I want you to understand that." He stopped working and turned to look at the older woman. "I understand it," he said. "Do you?" she said, not doubting exactly, just precise. "She came here with nothing and showed me everything she knew inside of a week," he said. "Not because she trusted me, she didn't know me, but because the land was in front of her and she couldn't stand by and watch it die when she could do something about it. That's who she is. She spent 4 years hiding that, and she walked onto my property, and she couldn't hide it for a week." He paused. "I know who she is. That's what I'm telling you." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Robert would have liked you," she said. He felt the words land, felt them in the same place Margaret's version of them had landed the same specific weight. "She said that too," he said. "We're alike in that way," Clara said. "When we see something worth saying, we say it." She left the barn, and he went back to the harness, and the feeling in his chest was the same one he'd been walking around with for weeks now, warm and serious and patient, waiting for the right moment, the way water waits to find its level. The right moment came the morning Clara's buggy pulled away. They stood in the yard and watched it go, the two of them, and when the sound of the wheels faded, Margaret stood for a moment longer, looking at the empty road, and then turned back to the ranch with an expression on her face that he hadn't seen before. Something settled and resolved, like a person who has finally finished grieving something and knows it. "She's good," Caleb said. "She's the best person I know," Margaret said. "After my father." He nodded. Then, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. And then almost to herself, "I'm better than all right. She stopped, seemed to notice something in how that was coming out. "I'm good," she said more simply. "The sketches," he said. She looked at him. "They're extraordinary," she said. "He documented 4 separate aquifer systems in this region that no one has ever followed up on. 4. The one here at Willow Creek is the smallest of them." She paused. "What he mapped, if it's accurate, and I believe it is. I know how he worked. There's enough underground water in this valley to change the entire agricultural profile of the county." He let that settle. "That's a significant thing to be sitting in a leather case in a barn." "Yes," she said. "It is." "What are you going to do with it?" She met his eyes. "We talked about this," she said, "on the way back from Alderson's." "The survey," he said. "The survey," she said. "A proper one. Following my father's work, verifying it, extending it, identifying every aquifer system in this watershed, and documenting how to access them." She paused. "Alderson's sons have already asked me about the methodology. There are 2 other ranchers who sent word asking if I'd look at their land, and that's from word of mouth alone in a month." "You want to do it here," he said. "I want to do it here," she said. "From here, using this as the model." She held his gaze direct as always. "But that means being here, not temporarily, not until the ranch is stable and it's time to move on." She paused. "And I told you I wasn't leaving, but telling you and asking you are different things." He looked at her. She was standing in the morning sun in the yard of his family's ranch with her father's leather case of sketches that she'd have carried to the ends of the earth to protect, and her notebooks in the house, and the green fields behind her that she'd built out of dry dust, and the refusal to believe what everyone else believed about this land. "You're not asking me to let you stay," he said. "No," she said. "I'm asking you if you want this. Both of us here. The ranch and the work and everything that comes with it. All of it." She held his gaze. "I need to know you've thought about it." "I've thought about almost nothing else for 6 weeks," he said. Something moved in her face. "That's Margaret." He said her name, and she stopped. "I need to say something, and I need you to let me say it without telling me it's too soon, or that you need more time, or any of the very sensible things you say when you're trying to protect yourself from something that scares you." She looked at him. Her jaw set slightly. "All right," she said. He took a breath. "This ranch was dying," he said. "And I was dying with it. Not physically, I don't mean that. But something in me was going the way grass goes when the water's gone long enough. Something essential. And you came here and put your hands on the ground and told me there was something alive underneath what everyone else said was dead." He paused. "You were talking about the water table. But I'm telling you, it was more than that." She was very still. "I don't want you here because the ranch needs you," he said. "The ranch did need you, and it doesn't anymore, or not in the same way. I want you here because I need—" He stopped. Found the right word. "Because I need this. What this is. You and me in this yard, in this kitchen, in this field at 3 in the morning, when the channel wall gives, and we work it through together." He held her gaze. "That's what I want. If you want it too." She looked at him for a long moment. He watched her face move through several things. Things she was processing, decisions being made at the speed only she operated at internally behind those dark eyes that saw everything. "I want it too," she said, quiet and completely certain. He crossed the yard and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him. She had to look up. He was half a head taller, with the most unguarded expression he'd ever seen on her face. Open and real, and a little afraid and fully present. He said, "May I?" She said yes. He kissed her there in the yard, gentle and certain. The way everything real is not dramatic, just true. The way water finding its level is true, inevitably going exactly where it was always meant to go. When they stepped back, she looked at him with something in her face that was new. Not the quiet, careful Margaret, who measured every word. Not the focused researcher. Not the woman who'd spent 4 years running from what had been taken from her. Someone freer than any of those. Someone who had perhaps for the first time in a long time put something down and not picked it back up. "Caleb Whitaker," she said. "You are," she said, "genuinely the strangest man I have ever met." "You keep saying that," he said. "I keep meaning it," she said. And she smiled, the full version, the one he'd been seeing in fragments and glimpses and almost moments for weeks now. Complete now. Real breaking across her face, like the first morning after a long drought, and the sky finally opening up. They stood together in the yard while the ranch moved around them. Pete and Horace at the north, the cattle at the water, the green fields holding their color in the morning light, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, Caleb Whitaker felt the solid ground of his own life beneath him, not the precarious ground of a man trying to hold something together with his bare hands. Not the crumbling ground of debt and drought and borrowed time, the solid ground of a thing that was going to last. 3 days later, Franklin Dunmore came to the ranch. He didn't come in the aggressive way he'd come before, or the calculating way, or with attorneys or bank inspectors, or advantageous timing. He came alone on his own horse in the middle of a working afternoon, and he tied up at the post and stood in the yard and waited, which was a thing Caleb had never seen Dunmore do before, simply wait without positioning, without an angle being worked. Caleb came out of the barn. He and Dunmore looked at each other across the yard for a moment. "Caleb," Dunmore said. "Franklin," Caleb said. Dunmore turned his hat in his hands. He looked older than he had the last time, or perhaps Caleb was simply seeing him differently. "The surveyor's report came through," Dunmore said. "I know," Caleb said. I owe you an apology, Dunmore said. The yard was quiet. Caleb waited. Not just for the claim, Dunmore said, though that too, for the whole of it. The bank pressure, Vance, the things Eleanor said in town. He stopped, started again. I watched this ranch going under, and I made myself believe I was being practical, that I was just making a business decision before someone else did. He paused. That was a lie, I told myself. And I told it loud enough that Eleanor told it too, and that wasn't fair to the woman you have here. Caleb looked at him steadily. Why are you telling me this now? He said. It wasn't hostile. He genuinely wanted to know. Dunmore's jaw worked. Because Alderson came to me last week, he said. Told me what she'd found on his north ridge. Told me what she said to him, that the whole valley has water nobody knows is there. That the land that's been dying out here hasn't been dying because it's bad land. It's been dying because nobody knew how to read it. He paused. And I thought about how hard I worked to make sure she didn't stay here long enough to find any of that. And He stopped. Margaret had come out onto the porch. She stood there, hands at her sides, looking at Dunmore with an expression that was neutral and waiting. Dunmore looked at her. Miss Ellis, he said. He held her gaze, which Caleb thought might have cost him something. I owe you an apology more than I owe him one. What my wife said, what I said, what I tried to do with the claim. He paused. None of it was right. And I'm standing here telling you so. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. What would you have done, she said, if the claim had held? If the water source had been ruled outside the boundary? Dunmore was quiet. Bought the rights, he said. Charged Caleb for water access until he couldn't pay it, and then bought the ranch. I know, she said. What changed your mind? Alderson's face, Dunmore said. When he talked about what you'd found on his land, what it meant for his family. He turned his hat again. I've been in this valley for 30 years. I know what it looks like when something turns. And what you're doing, what you've done here, that's something turning. I didn't want to be the thing standing in the way of it because of my own... He stopped. Because of my own small reasons. Another silence. Then Margaret came down off the porch and crossed the yard and stood in front of him. Apology accepted, she said, directly and without performance. And Mr. Dunmore, the survey I'm planning, of the valley's aquifer systems. I'll need landowner cooperation on the eastern ridge properties. Dunmore looked at her. Something shifted in his face. I have land on the eastern ridge, he said slowly. I know, she said. You have the largest parcel on the eastern ridge. And if my father's preliminary work is right, there's a significant system under it. She paused. I'd rather work with you than around you. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression was entirely different than anything she'd seen there before. You're asking me to cooperate with the survey, he said. I'm telling you what you'd be part of if you did, she said. What this valley could look like in 10 years if we find what I think is under that ridge. She held his gaze. That's worth more than anything you would have gotten from Caleb's water rights. By a significant margin. Dunmore looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him with an expression that offered nothing and took nothing away. Dunmore looked back at Margaret. When do you start? He said. Something that was almost a smile crossed her face. I already have, she said. She put out her hand. He looked at it. Then he shook it. He left 20 minutes later. Caleb and Margaret stood in the yard and watched him go, and for the second time in a week, they stood side by side watching a wagon disappear down the access road, and the quality of the watching was entirely different from any of the times before. You could have just accepted his apology and sent him home, Caleb said. I could have, she said. Instead, you recruited him. The eastern ridge is crucial to the survey, she said. And a man who's apologized for a wrong is either going to spend the rest of his life being your enemy out of shame, or going to spend it being useful. I'd rather have him useful. She paused. My father taught me that too. Caleb shook his head slowly. Is there anything your father didn't teach you? She thought about it seriously in that way she had of treating even light questions with real consideration. "How to do this," she said. He looked at her. "Being somewhere that's mine," she said. "Staying in one place long enough to learn its name. Having someone—" She paused. "He didn't teach me that, because he didn't know I'd need it, or I don't think he did." She looked at the field. "Maybe he did. Maybe that's why he told me to keep everything and keep moving. So I'd know what it felt like moving, so that when I stopped, it would mean something." Caleb reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically. Just took it the way you take the hand of someone who is standing next to you, and you want them to know you're there. She looked down at their hands. Then she turned her hand and held his, and neither of them said anything else, and the ranch moved quietly around them in the afternoon, and the water ran in the channels, and the cattle moved in the green northern field, and the whole living weight of it pressed gently and permanently into the ground beneath their feet. This was the thing Dunmore had tried to buy. This was the thing Weston had tried to erase. This was the thing Eleanor Dunmore had tried to make small with her loud, precise words in front of the dry goods store. It was not small. It had never been small. It was the size of a woman who carried her dead father's notebooks across 4 states because she believed in what was written in them. It was the size of a man who looked at that woman and saw not what everyone else saw, but what was actually there. It was the size of the water that had been under this land the whole time, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. It was the size of everything that lasts. The survey began on a Monday. Margaret had spent 3 weeks preparing for it, organizing her father's sketches, cross-referencing them with the grade calculations she'd built at Willow Creek, writing to 2 former colleagues of her father's at the Philadelphia University, who had replied with a speed that told her they'd been waiting for exactly this kind of project. She had a method, a timeline, and a set of maps that covered every landholding on the eastern ridge and the valley floor between them, marked with her father's preliminary notations and her own additions in a different ink, so anyone reading them could tell which observations came from Robert Ellis and which came from his daughter. She didn't separate them to diminish his contribution. She did it because the record needed to be clear about who had done what and when. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, and she wasn't going to give anyone the opportunity to blur those lines again. Caleb rode out with her on the first morning. Not because she needed him, she knew that, and so did he, but because it was the beginning of something, and beginnings deserved to be witnessed by people who understood their weight. They rode to the eastern ridge together in the early light, and she stood on the first survey point and opened her notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, and he watched her do it and felt the particular pride of someone who didn't build the thing but helped make it possible, which is its own kind of building. "How long?" he asked. "To survey the whole valley." She was already looking at the ridge reading it. 3 months for the primary mapping. Another 2 to verify the findings and draft the formal documentation. She paused. "If the eastern system is what I think it is, we'll need to bring in additional expertise for the deep assessment. Someone with drilling experience." "Dunmore might know who," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "He might," she agreed. "I'll ask him." He smiled. She'd been doing that using Dunmore as a resource, with the same practical ease that she used every other resource available to her, without sentiment or grudge, purely on the basis of what was useful. Dunmore, for his part, had turned out to be useful in ways that surprised even Caleb. The man knew this territory. He knew the landowners. The old survey disputes the water rights history going back 30 years. He knew things Margaret needed to know, and he told them to her without making her ask twice. Caleb suspected that Dunmore was experiencing the particular relief of a man who has been let off a hook he expected to hang from for a long time, and was channeling that relief into being genuinely cooperative. Whatever the reason, it worked, and Margaret accepted it without requiring any further confession or demonstration of contrition, which Caleb thought was the most efficient and also the most merciful approach, though he wasn't sure she'd describe it that way. She'd describe it as practical, which was for Margaret often the same thing. He left her on the ridge with her notebooks and her compass, and rode back to the ranch, and the day closed behind him with the particular quality of a day that is part of something larger, a stitch in a quilt, unremarkable in itself, but essential to the pattern. The first major finding came 5 weeks into the survey. Margaret had been working the northern end of the Dunmore property, the largest landholding on the eastern ridge, 5,300 acres of rocky upland that Dunmore had always managed as grazing land, because no one had ever suggested it could be anything else. She'd been working it for 4 days, and on the 5th day, she came back to the ranch at noon instead of evening, which she never did. And when she came in through the kitchen door, her face had the look it had on the rocky ridge at Willow Creek the day the water came up bright and certain and barely contained. Caleb looked up from the account book. "What did you find?" She set her notebook on the table and opened it to the sketch she'd been working on. "Look at this," she said. He looked. He understood enough of her mapping notation now to read the basic structure, the grade lines, the mineral markers, the depth estimates. What he was looking at was larger than anything she'd found at Willow Creek. Significantly larger. "How much larger?" he said. "The Whitaker Aquifer supplies enough water for 400 acres under full production," she said. "What's under the northern Dunmore section, if my father's sketch is right, and my readings are consistent with his?" She put her finger on the depth estimate. That system could supply the entire eastern ridge, every farm and ranch on that side of the valley. Full production, permanent. He sat back. "I know," she said. "You need to tell Dunmore. I'm riding there this afternoon," she said. "I wanted to tell you first." He looked at her across the table, at this woman who had arrived on a dusty wagon with a canvas satchel of notebooks and the wariness of someone who'd been burned too many times to come in from the cold easily and felt the full weight of everything she'd become in this place, or rather everything she'd always been and had finally been given room enough to show. "Go tell him," he said, "and then come home." She held his gaze for a moment. "Home," she said. "Home," he said. She went. Dunmore's reaction as reported by Margaret that evening had been to sit down in his chair and not say anything for almost 3 minutes, which she said was the longest she'd ever seen him be quiet, and then to say, "My God," and then to say, "What do we do next?" which Margaret considered to be exactly the right response in the right order. What they did next was invite the other Eastern Ridge landowners to a meeting. Margaret organized it. Caleb helped her prepare for it, sitting with her at the kitchen table for 3 evenings while she refined the presentation, asking the questions that a skeptical farmer would ask, so she could practice answering them, pointing out the places where her explanation was too technical and needed to come down a level. "Right here," he said on the second evening, pointing to a section of her notes, "where you talk about capillary action in fractured limestone. What does that mean to a man who's never heard of capillary action?" She frowned. "It means," in plain words, she thought, "it means the water moves up through the rock the same way water moves up a wick," she said slowly, "by itself, without pumping." "That's good," he said. "Say that." She wrote it down. He watched her hand move across the page and thought about how many rooms she'd been in over the years, where the version of her that was brilliant and precise and ahead of everyone in the room had been the reason people didn't listen. Where being too much of something had been held against her, the same way being too little was held against other women. He thought about the particular cruelty of that, not just the individual insults, but the accumulated systemic waste of it, all those years of someone this capable being told to make herself smaller. She wasn't making herself smaller tonight. She was leaning over a kitchen table in Montana, planning how to change the entire agricultural future of a valley. And the light was on her face, and she looked like exactly what she was. "What?" she said without looking up. "Nothing," he said. "Keep going." The meeting was held at the Harlow Creek Town Hall on a Thursday evening. 14 landowners came, which was more than Margaret had expected, and which Caleb had expected exactly, because he knew these people, and he knew what the rumor of water under their dry land would do to a room. She stood in front of them with her maps and her notebooks and her plain, careful words, and Caleb sat in the second row and watched the room watch. Her watched the skepticism in the faces of men who had never taken direction from a woman and watched it shift as she spoke. Not all at once, and not in every face, but in enough of them that the room changed temperature somewhere around the 15-minute mark. The first real question came from a rancher named Haskell, who had land on the southwestern ridge, and the expression of a man who had been disappointed by promised things too many times to believe in them easily. "How do we know this isn't the same kind of survey talk we heard from the county 10 years ago?" he said. They told us there was water on the North Basin, sent men out to drill, found nothing. I know the county survey you're referring to, Margaret said. She said it without flinching and without getting defensive. It used surface mapping methods that were adequate for the technology of the time, but didn't have the tools to read subsurface limestone fracturing. What I'm using is my father's methodology, which he developed specifically because those surface methods kept missing what was actually there. She paused. I also have a working example. You're all aware of what happened at Willow Creek. The aquifer I found there was not visible on any surface survey. It was found using this method. Haskell looked at her. You're the woman who did that, he said. Not skeptically, more like he was confirming something he'd half believed and now believed fully. Yes, she said. Another rancher in the back, a younger man named Cortez, who had land bordering the Dunmore property, said, if the eastern system is what you say it is, what does access look like? Who controls the water rights? That's the right question, Margaret said. And the answer I'm proposing is a cooperative water rights structure. No single landowner holds the source rights. The system is managed collectively with access proportional to acreage. Every property on the eastern ridge has a stake and a share. She paused. That's how it stays out of any one person's hands, including mine, including Mr. Dunmore's. She looked at Dunmore when she said it. Dunmore, to his credit, nodded. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Alderson, who was there with his oldest son, said, I'll sign on. He said it simply the way he'd said everything since the day on his north ridge when the water came up. Whatever she's asking us to do, I'm in. The room shifted again, and then one by one the hands went up, not all of them. 3 of the 14 held back men who needed more time, or who would need to see another working example before they committed, which was fair and reasonable, and Margaret noted without complaint. We'll do the northern Dunmore section first, she said. By spring they'll be able to see the results. Then we'll talk again. 11 out of 14 was, Caleb thought, on the drive home that evening, one of the most significant things he'd ever sat in a room and watched happen. He said so. 11 is a start, she said. She was looking at the road, thinking through the next steps, as she always was, that engine in her running constantly and quietly. Margaret, he said. She looked at him. Can you just for the next 10 minutes, let it be what it was, he said. 11 people who didn't know you 6 months ago said yes to you tonight. That's worth sitting with for 10 minutes. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the road. Then slowly she let out a long breath and settled back in the wagon seat and let her shoulders come down from where she'd been holding them. 11 people, she said. 11 people, he said. She was quiet for a moment. My father would have been in that room, she said, asking the most difficult questions just to make sure my answers were strong enough. Haskell did a decent job of that, Caleb said. She made the laugh sound the real one, the full version. He really did, she said. And then she leaned slightly against Caleb's shoulder, just the smallest increment, barely perceptible, the kind of closeness that doesn't announce itself, and he didn't say anything about it, and neither did she. And they rode the rest of the way home in the easy quiet of people who have built something together and know it's going to hold. The proposal came 2 weeks later. Not because Caleb had planned it for that day particularly, but because the moment arrived the way right moments do, without announcement in the middle of something ordinary. When the thing you want to say has been waiting at the back of your throat long enough that the next available quiet is when it comes out. They were in the kitchen after supper. Margaret was at the table going over the Eastern Ridge survey notes, and Caleb was washing the dishes, which he'd taken to doing without any discussion about whose job it was or wasn't, because the dishes needed doing, and his hands needed something to do while she worked, and it had simply settled into habit the way the good things had. He dried his hands on the towel, turned around, looked at her bent over her notebook with a pencil tucked behind her ear and ink on the third finger of her right hand, the way she always had ink on the third finger of her right hand by the end of an evening. Margaret, he said. She said, not looking up. I want to marry you, he said. She looked up. He held her gaze. I've been thinking about how to say it properly for about 3 weeks, he said, and I've decided there isn't a proper way that's also true, and I'd rather be true, So that's what I said. She looked at him for a long moment. The pencil was still in her hand. You want to marry me, she said. Yes, he said. Caleb, I know what you're going to say, he said. You're going to say it's too soon, or that you need to think about it, or that there are practical considerations. And all of those things may be true. But I want you to know that none of them change what I just said, and whatever time you need is time I have, and I'm not asking because of the ranch or the survey, or because it's the proper thing to do. He paused. I'm asking because the idea of any version of my life that doesn't have you in the middle of it makes no sense to me anymore. And I'd like to stop pretending I don't feel that. She was very still. The kitchen was very quiet. Then she set the pencil down on the notebook carefully and folded her hands on the table and looked at him with the most direct and open expression he'd ever seen on her face, more open than the field at Willow Creek. On the 12th day, more open than the moment she'd told him she wasn't leaving, more open than anything before. I spent 4 years being afraid, she said, of being seen, of being somewhere long enough for people to decide they didn't want me there, of letting someone matter enough to hurt me. She paused. And then I drove a wagon onto your property, and I was so busy trying to hide what I knew that I didn't notice for a while that you weren't looking at me the way everyone else had been looking at me. And by the time I noticed, she stopped. By the time I noticed, it was too late to be afraid of it. It had already happened. I was very still. Yes, she said. I want to marry you. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his hands on her face, the way her aunt had, and she let him, and put her hands over his, and they stayed there for a moment like that, just that forehead close to forehead, breathing the same air. Thank God, he said. His voice was not entirely steady. She laughed, the full, real one, warm and unguarded, the laugh that had taken weeks to hear, and that he now thought was one of the finest sounds he'd ever been in the presence of. You were nervous, she said. Absolutely terrified, he said. Good, she said. Now you know how it feels. He pulled back enough to look at her face. How what feels? Being seen, she said. And waiting to find out if it's safe. He looked at her for a long moment. It's safe, he said. I know, she said. That's why I said yes. They were married on the first Saturday of October, when the Montana sky had gone the particular blue of early autumn, and the air had the first edge of cold in it that meant the season was turning. The ceremony was small. Clara had come back from Philadelphia, arriving 2 days before, with a trunk of things. She said Margaret's father had always meant to give her, and that Clara had been keeping for this occasion, though no one had told her the occasion was coming. She'd known anyway. Caleb wasn't surprised. The neighbors came. Alderson brought his whole family. Haskell came, and Cortez and 8 of the other landowners from the Thursday meeting. Pete wore a clean shirt that still somehow managed to look like Pete's shirt. Horace stood at the back with his hat in his hands and cried with the particular silent efficiency of a man who believes crying is fine, but doesn't need to be witnessed, which everyone witnessed. Margaret wore a dress that Clara had brought, deep blue, the color of good water, simple and clean and exactly right for the woman wearing it. She walked across the yard to where Caleb was standing with no ceremony and no music, and stopped in front of him and looked at him with those dark eyes that had been reading things correctly since the first morning she'd crouched in his dirt. The minister was brief because Caleb had asked him to be. The only moment that stretched was the vows, which they had written themselves, sitting at the kitchen table separately, and then reading them to each other the night before, which had produced a silence from both of them that said everything their words had been reaching toward. When Caleb said his voice was steady. He'd practiced the steadiness. When Margaret said hers, her voice was also steady. She hadn't needed to practice. Afterward, in the yard with coffee and food, and the neighbors moving around them, Clara found Caleb standing at the edge of the gathering and stood beside him. She's happy, Clara said. She said it with the precise weight of someone reporting something they've waited a long time to be able to report. Yeah, he said. He was watching Margaret across the yard. She was talking to Alderson's oldest son about the Northern Survey, because of course she was, and her hands were moving the way they moved when she was explaining something she cared about, and her face had that light in it. She hasn't been happy, Clara said. Not since Robert died. Maybe not for some time before that. She was working and surviving and fighting, and those things look like living, but they're not the same thing. No, Caleb said. They're not. What you've given her. Clara stopped. Not the ranch, not the survey, not any of the practical things. You know what I mean. A place to stand, he said. Clara looked at him. Yes, she said. Exactly that. The survey's first major results came that December, when the Northern Dunmore excavation confirmed everything Margaret had mapped. The system was larger than even her most optimistic estimate, deep, clean, and abundant in a way that the valley hadn't seen in living memory. The county sent their own hydrologist to verify the findings, which was the same hydrologist who'd wanted to correspond with Margaret after Vance's inspection, and he arrived in a state of professional excitement that Margaret met with the same calm certainty she brought to everything which Caleb privately found very funny. You're not surprised, the hydrologist said, standing at the excavation point with water rising around his boots, looking at the readings with an expression of nearly religious awe. No, Margaret said. You expected this. I calculated this, she said gently. There's a difference. The hydrologist looked at her. Then he said, Mrs. Whitaker, how would you feel about co-authoring a paper on the methodology for the National Agricultural Review? Margaret was quiet for a moment. She looked at Caleb, who was standing nearby with the particular expression he had when he was trying not to smile too obviously. I'd feel, she said, that it was long overdue. The paper went out in the spring. Both names on it. Robert Ellis and Margaret Whitaker, née Ellis. The methodology her father had spent 30 years developing completed and applied and proven by his daughter. The record finally accurately reflecting what had actually happened. When the copies arrived from the publisher, Margaret held one in her hands for a long moment before saying anything. They were in the kitchen, always the kitchen, the room where everything important had happened between them from the very first evening. She looked at the names on the front page. Then she said, he would have insisted his name come second. You think so? Caleb said. He always said the student who surpasses the teacher is the teacher's greatest work, she said. He would have wanted my name first. She paused. I put his first anyway. Because... She looked up from the paper. Because without him, I would have known the knowledge, and had no one to teach me that I had the right to use it. That matters as much as the knowledge itself. She set the paper down carefully. Maybe more. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her from behind his chin on her shoulder, and they both looked at the paper on the table. Hal was right, Caleb said. You are his greatest work. She put her hands over his. Don't make me cry, she said. I have survey notes to finish. You always have survey notes to finish. The Eastern Secondary System won't map itself, she said. But she didn't move. They stood there for a while, both of them looking at the paper with the two names on it, and the kitchen was warm around them, and outside the fields were holding their green through the tail end of winter. The way strong things hold on not easily, but certainly because they have what they need, and they know it. Spring came the way. It always comes to Montana, late and sudden, and then everywhere at once, as if the land had been holding its breath, and finally decided to let it go. The cattle on the north section were fat and moving well. The Eastern Ridge landowners had begun their own excavations based on Margaret's survey maps, and the news coming back from those sites was good, uniformly, increasingly, remarkably good. People came to Willow Creek, now the way they used to come to the county office, or the land office looking for information, looking for guidance. Margaret handled them with the same patient precision she brought to everything. She was never dismissive and never impatient, but she was also never more than necessary. She told people what they needed to know, to do what they needed to do, and sent them off to do it, and went back to her own work. She had hired 2 assistants by spring young women, both of them, which caused talk in town that Margaret did not acknowledge in any way, except to give them more responsibility when they proved they could handle it, which they both proved quickly. Caleb watched her build it and felt the particular pride that belongs to someone who saw what was coming before it arrived. He hadn't known the specifics, hadn't known about the survey, or the regional implications, or the paper, or the assistants. But he'd known from the morning she stood in his south field and pressed her hands into his earth that whatever she was building was going to be larger than either of them could see from where they were standing. He'd been right. He was glad he hadn't said so at the time, because she would have told him to focus on the grade angle of the current channel and stop getting ahead of himself. She wouldn't have been wrong. The afternoon of the first anniversary of her arrival at Willow Creek, he found her at the edge of the south field, the original section, the first one, the patch of green that had started everything. She was standing where they'd stood on the 12th day when the water came up with her hands in her pockets and her face turned toward whatever she was seeing, which wasn't the field and wasn't the hills, but something further back, something internal. He came and stood beside her. 1 year, he said. 1 year, she said. He looked at the field. Green all the way to the ridge now, not just the edge section. All 4 quadrants producing. The cattle count rebuilt. The loan restructured and half repaid already ahead of schedule. "Do you remember what you said that first morning?" she asked. "When I told you there was water here." "I said I'd give you the chance to prove it," he said. "Not that I believed it." "You were honest about that," she said. "That was the first thing I noticed about you. You didn't pretend." "Neither did you," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I almost didn't stop here," she said. "I was going further north. I'd heard there was work up near the Canadian line. I only stopped in Harlow Creek because one of the horses threw a shoe." He looked at her. "You never told me that." "I know," she said. "I didn't want to make it sound like accident." She paused. "But I've been thinking about it. Whether it was accident or whether—" She stopped. "My father used to say that the land finds its people. That the right piece of ground calls the right person to it eventually. That you can be running from everything you are for years, and the land will still find a way to put you where you belong." He looked at the field, at the green of it steady and real, holding its color against the sky. "And this is where you belong," he said. She turned to look at him, and in her face was everything. The years of running and hiding the loss of her father, the theft of her work, the long, careful process of learning to trust a man who had given her every reason to, and waited patiently for her to arrive at it on her own terms. All of it was in her face, and over all of it was something else. Something settled and permanent and radiantly quietly certain. "This is exactly where I belong," she said. He took her hand, she held it, and out across Willow Creek Ranch, across the green fields, and the running channels, and the cattle moving in the afternoon light, across the eastern ridge, where the survey flags marked the water that had been there all along. Waiting to be found. The land that had been dying, breathed full and steady and alive, because a woman no one expected had arrived with the knowledge to save it, and a man no one expected had been wise enough to let her. The land had called her here. She had answered, and from that day forward, not a single thing about Willow Creek Ranch was ever ordinary.